I think
It's
I'm
because
blaming
Moonkins
titles.
No, it's because Moonkins looks so fucking dumb. Like, how can you look at a Moonkin and not hate that thing? Like, independent of how good or bad it is, it looks so stupid that it's easy to be like, only evil people would play that dumb-looking bird.
I noticed on Twitter there's a lot of takes at the moment about Mythic Raid and stuff, and I thought I would just gather some people with different backgrounds and see where it's at. So I got JB, who's a Mythic Pluser, who pretty vocally dislikes having to raid for BIS gear. No idea what his progression level is. Naguura, who is a former World First Raider, current World First caster, and current like mid-level like cutting edge raid, which is important because that perspective needs to be taken into account as well. And then I got Asmon because he is someone who plays the game, I think, like at a much more casual level. That is what his preference has been for a while. So I'd let him speak on behalf of the casuals. Well, I posted a tweet earlier, new videos out, and also I think I'm about to hit 100k subs too, which is pretty cool. Although I don't really want to hit 100k subs now. I'd rather get 100k subs in like a week when I've moved into my new house, because I'm pretty sure YouTube instantly ships you that plaque, and I'm about to move and the address they have is this apartment, which I'm not going to live here anymore. So for sure, sub to my channel, but do it in like a week or two. I feel like we're going to have some pretty good conversation. I already know I agree on a few points from almost everyone in the call, but I don't know if everyone in the call agrees with each other. So, and it's not like we need to come to a conclusion on anyone feeling right. It's just important that people can say what they want and hear different sides of it. Try to come to some kind of conclusion, I guess. When everyone joins, we'll be good to go. I just don't know exactly when JB's going to join. Oh, it's up, Asmon.
Not much, man. Just chilling.
So I don't know when JB is exactly going to be here, because I told him initially it could be like in like 40 minutes, so he'll just kind of join whenever. But the reason I wanted to talk to him is like, so I was like kind of watching Twitter. I like just got back from vacation, and I saw like a bunch of different takes about, you know, just like where Mythic rating is at the moment, because like it all stemmed from like a lot of people, I guess, complaining that it's been nerfed too much, or that the raid was like too hard, or and then I think that just led into a much broader conversation about like Mythic's difficulty in general. You know, like Final Fantasy has a good, you know, system that works for them, extremely different how gear works in both of the games respectively, but like it's always fun to look at like how that would look, or if that's, you know, how that could apply to this game. And specifically JB was, you know, Mythic Pluser, I only raid for gear, why can't I have the best gear, why do I have to do this mode? I think Naguura actually has excellent perspective, former multiple World First Raider, current caster for the World First race, but I think you also do a ton of Mythic Plus, and you also raid in a guild that gets cutting edge, right? So like I think you're a good person to like represent the like mid-level, because it's not just like people who are casuals, which like that's a very broad term they use for different reasons, but like people who maybe just get into Mythic, or it doesn't even really apply to them, but also someone with like top level experience. And then Asmon, I know you've played at different levels throughout your time in WoW. I don't follow your alt channel, so I don't know how much you play WoW currently, but I know you've done like a lot of raid content in the past.
I was good at the game 10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. So and then obviously you'll have your perspective, and so we can kind of start without JB. I'm in a weird spot where like I've always kind of been on the side of, I think the race world first is such a unique thing that obviously like the whole like why would you design it for this few people kind of thing, but just almost any time historically when they've designed the game for us or made choices based on us, they were almost universally bad, not just for the whole game, but actually for us. Like they just have a fundamental misunderstanding.
Like tier gear?
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of get into some anecdotes about that specifically, but I just kind of wanted to let everyone know here, like who's talking and why, and just kind of let you guys. This is not formal at all. We can just have a big, open, broad conversation about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what happens, is that you have the raids, and I feel like the raids have in general just over time gotten harder and harder. And if you look at the participation for the raids on, let's say, like Warcraft logs or wherever else you can actually find, and it's hard, right? It's hard to find reliable third-party information about it. But I do think that if you compare the amount of parses and the success rate of Mythic WoW, or Mythic ratings in WoW, it has gotten progressively harder. And I think that's happened at the expense of just average players that used to raid at a high level, and now they feel like they're not able to do that because of there's a number of things. You have other games that have a lower barrier to entry, like Final Fantasy. Like there's one big thing is having 20 people in the raid is probably one of the biggest reasons why raiding is hard to do now, is you just have so many people. And if you compare that to Lost Ark or Final Fantasy, at least. And what happens is that I think the raids get harder and harder, and the players don't really get that much better, and it becomes more alienating to those players. And I don't think that's necessarily bad to have content that's extremely hard to do, but I think you can make a pretty strong argument that most of the content that comes out of a patch is the raid content. So if the raid content isn't really appealing or rewarding for people that are trying to participate in it, then the devs are doing a pretty big disservice to their whole community whenever they're designing content that's built around completion rates of the 1%. Like one example that I can use for this is that I think it was Ian, but I don't remember exactly who, mentioned that a raid tier should take longer than 1 week to be cleared by a guild. And I find that to be kind of a ridiculous measurement of quality, because these are people, Max and many other people like you guys raid 16 hours a day whenever these things comes out, sometimes less, but you raid a lot pretty much all day. And on top of that, your entire job is built around the game. And so I think that if you use people like that as a measurement for success, you're not looking at the other cases where 99.9% of players may run into difficulty or frustration.
No, absolutely. I think over time too. So there's a lot there, but like I think like over time, that metric that they've used, like Ian has said that, I don't know if that's their overall design metric, but I think it has been like generally pretty hands off for the world first. I think the only thing they've done is they've made it so like like 7 or 8 bosses in the raid, they've had rhetoric before where they're saying, oh well, the only people who are seeing these bosses this week are those guilds. So we don't have to worry about tuning these bosses right now for them, at least damage and healing wise. So that allows us to get to them, do them, and then like naturally when guilds get to them with lockouts of gear, those bosses are easier. I think that played out through most of Legion. WoD and MoP were a bit different, although I will say the overall, if you want to talk like historically about the difficulty of raiding in this game, I think 25-man Heroic and Mythic kind of continued along the same path. Like the times, I can't speak much for like the mid-level, like, the person who guts cutting edge, but maybe closer to the end of the patch. I can't speak for difficulty for them, but specifically time taken to clear for world first has been almost consistent. If any time actually longer back in the day, back when there's 25-man Heroic all the way through Mythic, and it's kind of gotten to around a median level of about 8 or 9 days after it's released to be cleared now, with this raid being a giant outlier, and then in the opposite direction, things like Emerald Nightmare being a giant outlier. But I think over time, like the progression experience has been good for people. It's just that with more of the reliance on weak auras over time, I think what you've seen more than obviously the general player base is getting better over that period, but I think the rate at which the very top levels are getting better and the things they're using to support themselves, like weak auras, are actually progressing at a rate that's far beyond that. And I think that's kind of how you ended up in Sepulcher. But
it's an artificial skill gap, yeah.
Yeah, but I think Sepulcher was, I actually don't know how bad it was for, like the other raids in this expansion, specifically Castle Nathria. I think Castle Nathria was almost an example of really good difficulty, and it kind of shows why. I don't know. Did you raid in Castle Nathria?
Yeah, I didn't do Mythic. I did like half of it, but that was about it.
Okay.
So like I don't know Stone Legion Generals and Denathris, but I know all the other fights.
But a lot of the like later fights in that raid were hard for the right reason. Like a lot of it was
Sludge Fist.
Yeah, Sludge Fist, and then very much like Denathrius was just attrition. You just got better at it over time. I think where Sepulcher, and why this is more of a conversation now and why they've really messed this up, is clearly this is the first time they've ever done this, in my opinion. I think you might argue that they've done this before. This, in my opinion, this raid was the first time they've ever actually been like, okay, we have this product in the race world first that's marketing our game, and like, let's just make it the biggest and best it can be. The primary difference there across everything else, the thing that I've noted, is in the past, every boss we've killed in the past 3 years has been killable in week 1. It was possible to kill. The last boss was tuned to be killable in the first week. This raid, The 7th boss and onward was tuned to be killed with exactly the gear we had at the time, and because of the progression system in the patch, that ended up being the last boss was able to be tuned and killed by the best guilds in like week 3. And that has to do with it mechanically as well. Like Anduin, right? What they're nerfing about this raid, like people will talk a lot about, how, oh, well, usually everyone gets a bunch of gear after the world first, so it's mitigated that way. In this raid, we had all the gear by the time it was killed. And then also, the things that were wiping you were not things... They used to basically tune the numbers around the world first race, always. And I think that worked out fine over a patch. This raid, they tuned it mechanically. And things like Anduin, you learn that fight 2 seconds at a time. Because everything is like, you either do it or you don't, and that's it. It's over. There's no like limping for 2 minutes and continuing to learn, and that's exactly much of the same on Jailer, Lihivum. A bunch of fights on Mythic have those kind of mechanics, and I think that's the reason why this raid has seemed worse than others, because of that decision. And sorry, Naguura, I know you haven't been able to talk a lot. Sorry.
All good, all good. I do think that, like, I generally agree with everything you guys are saying, and I think Sepulcher is also a tier where, honestly, I think Blizzard did not think it would go this way. I think Blizzard thought that you guys go in, didn't expect the raceable first guilds to get 4-set pretty quickly, and just kind of assumed they're going to tune it around you not having 4-set, and also tune it around you not having the second legendary, right? I think that was their plan. But then they realized, oh, you guys are doing the whole trading thing, and you have the 4-set, and all of a sudden they needed to keep the bosses as difficult, or maybe even buff them, because that happened, right? Before you guys reached bosses, they even buffed some of them. And then this whole problem happened where they had to actively nerf bosses instead of passively nerfing them through gear progression, which is what they usually try to do. And most people don't complain too much about passive nerfs if it's through player power that you're gaining over the course of a couple of weeks, because then it's not as obvious, first of all, that it's getting nerfed. And additionally, the nerf also happens gradually over time, and not all of a sudden, you're progressing a boss, and then the next day, like, a mechanic works completely differently, or 10% of the HP has been removed, right? Because that is also a problem for people who are currently progressing, because it feels like, oh, if we just would have killed it yesterday, it would have been a bigger achievement compared to killing it today after it was nerfed, right?
I think that's very true. I mean, if you go back and you look at pretty much every expansion in recent history, there has been a cascading or increasing power buff to players. In ICC, you had the ICC buff. In Dragon Soul, you had a debuff. In Mists of Pandaria, you had, remember, you were able to upgrade your gear 2 of 2 and then 4 of 4 that would make it better. And you had the legendary cloak. And then in WoD, you had the legendary ring that got more powerful. Legion, you had the, different artifact trait levels that would just make you passively stronger over time. And BFA, we had corruptions. So it's like, this is probably one of the first patches that we've had, expansions we've had in really a very long time, where there's not a just consistently increasing power gap. And you're right that whenever you have like a flat nerf to the boss, it feels like there's a weird psychology that I think happens whenever people build their character up more powerful over time through, like, let's say legendary rings in WoD or something like that, where they feel like they've kind of owned or earned that progression, versus whenever a nerf happens and now it's just simply easier. It's more on the nose, and it doesn't feel as it doesn't feel earned.
Yeah.
See, yes, but I think, I don't know how many people are actually affected by that. So I've heard a lot of people, especially like a lot of my peers, complaining about the nerfs this raid recently. I feel like a lot of them are very justified. I mean, they're like blasting the raid for sure, but I wonder who's actually negatively affected by it. You see a lot of like default Twitter eggs, just saying, oh man, like my achievement is ruined. Like, honestly, I feel like the people who are progressing on, let's just say a boss like Halandris, and they get it to 2%, and the weekly reset rolls over and it gets buffed to 30-second bombs, and they are robbed of that experience, and that, like, oh man, like I wish we would have got the kill before the boss was massively easier. But I think there's a very small amount of those people, because I think realistically, if you've already killed the fight, it's like, oh, easier reclears now, and we spend less time in the raid. That's great. That's cool. Why would you ever be mad about that? And then the people doing it, eventually, maybe one person in an entire guild actually feels that way. Like it's like a super long, month-long time commitment to get cutting edge for so many players. They're just trying to get through the raid and get their gear and get out. You know, there's just so many people like that I don't know if those people's experiences are necessarily trivialized, especially in a raid like this where there is no expansion ending system that's making this easier. Like the only way to make this raid easier, which you can see with statistics like this raid, especially Anduin, is a massive wall. You know, like they're not really getting past it, and something has to change there. Oh, what's up, Jeb?
What up?
Hello.
Hey, man.
I do want to say something about that, just because I do think you're right that a lot of people mainly rate Mythic nowadays for the gear and not necessarily for like any bigger achievements. I'm sure there are people like that still that rate for the achievements, especially like the first couple of guilds to clear the raid, like Race to World first and whatever. And like mid-tier guilds, I would say, would like play for gear rather than for achievements. But I think that has changed over the history of raiding for like a negative way, and I do think that can be improved again. I don't think it has to be this way, right? I don't think Mythic raiding should only be for gear, and it should still be enjoyable for you to get a difficult boss done and not be like, oh, finally it got nerfed and I can kill it. And especially when it comes to these active nerfs, I also think it's much, much better if you can somehow turn those nerfs off. Like the ICC buff, like Asmon mentioned, that was a buff that happened over weeks. But if you wanted to turn off the buff, you could. At least you have the option to. Not that many people would have done that.
Yeah,
but
that's my
if you
issue.
like want to try, you know?
That's my issue, because Final Fantasy does this really well as well. You can go back and do, it's a little different because of scaling and job changes, but you can go back and do old encounters at min eye level and do it
Exactly, yeah.
somewhat close to what was done back then. Not really, but like you can make it challenging if you want. My only issue is, and I thought about this too, I was like, what if what if there was this feat of strength mode where Mythic was tuned to be a bit easier, but like, you could go and set your mode to whatever the world first kills had at the time, and you can have the exact same tuning and everything, and you can try for it. And I was just thinking, like, yeah, that sounds really cool for exactly like 100 people. I don't know if there's a big enough market of people with how long the slog is in a season in WoW that would actually ever get a group of people, especially their own guild. It'd probably have to be a bunch of people from different guilds to go back and actually spend time and do that. I don't think there's a huge market of people that would actually be interested in doing those things.
Well, you can look at some. Oh, go ahead, Naguura.
I just quickly wanted to say, I think the market would be much bigger if the raid size for the hardest difficulty would be lower,
Less,
right?
yeah.
Like Asmon said earlier. Because yeah, finding 19 people that are going to do a raid that is more difficult just because is going to be very hard. But if you only need to find like, I don't know, 9 players or like a smaller amount, then I think the incentive is going to be a lot bigger and people would be more motivated to try. Same as in Final Fantasy XIV, where people choose to go back and do old raids for fun, right?
I think that we've already seen this happen before. If you look at something like Herald of the Titans, that's effectively kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, the people that cleared it at the beginning were probably using a mismatch of gear, and there have been times where Herald of the Titans is 3-manable. But the idea of going back and being able to do challenges that are at a certain item level, and there was also another one in TOGC. It was called Argent Defender, tribute to Dedicated Insanity, and that one was removed. But you can still go back and get Herald of the Titans now. I think the reason why you have a lot more population of people that are like doing, let's say, like Ultimates in Final Fantasy or viewing them positively, is that I think there's a perception, and this is a perception that I have, is that the tuning and the focusing around making sure that the fine-tuning of the raid, like in a way, just the idea that guilds clearing it very quickly, like a professional guild clearing this on week 1, is even a problem that needs to be solved. I think is problematic, because this is not something that's it's not something that affects an average player. It's not the average player experience, and I think that in many cases it's the opposite of the average player experience, especially whenever you talk about mechanical difficulty for certain fights. So you look at something like Star Augur, for example, the mechanical difficulty is going to be much harder whenever you're dealing with like a more casual guild. And whenever you have like insta-wipe mechanics like that, it becomes really difficult to see an average guild or like a more casual guild progress on it. And whenever gear is locked behind it, then you have even more frustration.
I think
you guys may have covered this before I got in, so I apologize. But in a general sense, do you guys think Final Fantasy XIV's raid format is better or worse than WoW, and like independent of the actual bosses themselves, like boss design, in terms of the size of the raids, the way the loot works, I'll admit I am not very familiar with it, but I feel like every time I go on Twitter and I'm like, man, I'd really like to see Blizzard do like X, Y, or Z with raiding. Someone's like, oh, it's actually the way it works in Final Fantasy
Well,
14.
I feel like Final Fantasy. Well, there's two parts of that. There's the way the raids work and then looting. So I feel like one reason why it's really hard to compare so many things between the two games is that gear is handled entirely differently.
Yeah.
Like if you think about the way you play WoW on a new season, basically why you're making any decision you make when you log in is to get more gear from the second the season starts until the second it ends. It's like the whole progression of gear, even when WoW has been at its best, that's been why you were playing the game. And Final Fantasy gear is almost a means to an end. It's something you get from the raid content that isn't required, that's usually based off of a side story, and you get it and it's fine. And then like the hardest difficulty, it's so hard to tell difficulties because it's more like a bunch of fights mashed in one, extremely difficult, especially the recent one. It doesn't loot things and it's only cosmetic. But the thing is like getting gear and getting the best gear is so much more core to WoW than that game. And then about the raid size, there's about half as many jobs as there are specs in WoW. And I think it's possible that if you were to like, especially at this point, drop back into a lower amount of players, my take is that I think it would compromise the integrity of raid encounters in WoW specifically, but I think if I was making a new game that was exactly like WoW, literally the same game, I think I would make it with 10 or less, because that's just like how people play games in 2022. There's just, you have like small groups of friends you play games with. You just don't like having a 20-man team in today's day and age is like pretty impossible, but I don't know if that's actually the route you would ever go down for WoW specifically.
Well, you can look at Classic WoW, and there's a lot of people that raided in Classic WoW with 40 members, and now you see, like, I was comparing the amount of, like, clears from Sunwell versus Sepulcher, and Sunwell, like, just for one spec, like, for Destruction Warlock, there was, like, 600,000 parses of just Destruction Warlocks in Sunwell Plateau. So I think that the size of the raid is important, especially whenever you're dealing. It's kind of like an inverse thing, where the harder the content is, the more frustrating it is to have a lot of people. And like I think you
Definitely.
even saw that with like Nax in Classic WoW. It's like, okay, now we have a raid where one person can wipe the raid and there's 40 people and it took 2 hours to get here. It makes it way harder. I think that it's very hard to compare Final Fantasy rating with WoW rating, but I do think that, like Max, you bring up a good point, that there are effectively way more variables in WoW rating. And I think that because there are so many more variables, you do have situations where fights are either very overtuned or undertuned. And you had this especially happen in Cataclysm when you had 10 mans versus 25 mans.
Mm-hmm.
And you had some bosses that were just, impossible on 10 man. And then other fights that were just impossible on 25 man for a lot of guilds. And swapping to 10 or 25 inversely would just make it easy.
Correct.
I quickly wanted to say that I think a big reason why they divided the difficulties in the raids in the first was like their goal when they started doing normal mode, heroic, mythic was to kind of cover each player base, because a lot of people were raiding from the start of World of Warcraft, but after a couple of years it turned out, oh, there's people who are much more hardcore than others are, right? So they decided, okay, let's just split the raid to cater to those different kinds of player bases that raid for different reasons. So we have normal mode, we have heroic, and we have mythic. And mythic's intention, obviously, was to be the hardest version of the raid, to cater towards people who really want the challenge. And I think it worked out really well at the start. But over the years, as you guys have been saying, gear just became so important in WoW, and people are striving so much to get gear upgrades and player power upgrades. Even people that are like more casual, quote unquote, they're just do mythic for the gear and maybe also do heroic for the gear and don't necessarily seek the challenge anymore. So I think their whole point of dividing the difficulties kind of failed nowadays. Like it worked out in the past, but now it's just kind of redundant because everyone ends up doing mythic anyway, just because they want the item level, because it drops the highest item level. So I do think just approaching WoW rating the same way as Final Fantasy XIV, with having like an ultimate version that scales your gear and possibly does not drop item upgrades, would really kind of solve a lot of issues that WoW rating nowadays has, because then they can really cater that kind of ultimate version around those players who only seek the challenge, and maybe the heroic version of the raid would be a little bit easier, like for normal raiders that seek a challenge, but not like an insane challenge, and they would still get the highest item level there. And it's also flexible rates that we have in heroic, right, where you can go in with 10 people or with 20 or with 30 or whatever. And I think it would really like motivate a lot more people to do raiding again if it drops the highest item level on heroic. And I know there's going to be a lot less people who are going to do this kind of ultimate version of the raid if it doesn't drop item upgrades, for sure. But I still think the existence of it is still important, just to have like an aspiration to maybe go for in the future, and to see those players who have those transmogs walking around, because it works in Final Fantasy XIV as well with the ultimates. Because there isn't a lot of players that actually do ultimates, but people still like that it exists, and they want it to be like good raids, and they like watching the other players walk around with those beautiful transmogged weapons, right?
Well, they also have that in Lost Ark too. They have the Hell
Yeah.
mode, which is where your item level is locked, your your abilities are, but you can change your abilities, but like the amount of skill points you have is locked, and like the boss is basically in its hardest version, and you can go back and do it. I think that would be a lot better. And I do think that a lot of it does come from people not being able to get the best gear, because WoW players, especially now, and I think it's become this way to a fault, is that WoW players are extremely goal oriented, right? Everything is like constantly min maxed, and people are trying to play the game in the most efficient and optimized way possible.
Do you think that people in WoW are more likely to raid Mythic because of the gear it drops, or raid Mythic because they like it?
I think that if you took gear out of Mythic raiding, participation would drop by at least 90%.
Yeah, and it's honestly one of the weirdest. There's a few justifications I see people give on Twitter often for like why they think Mythic should drop the best gear, and like one of the weirdest ones to me is when people say you have to put the best gear in there or nobody's going to do it, and it's like, well, hold on, let me run this back. You're telling me the only reason that you raid is for gear, and if you stop getting gear, you'd stop raiding. This is not a very good argument for why like raiding should continue to exist in its current form. Like that it's like so tedious that the only reason you'd go there is to get gear.
That's me.
This sounds like a problem and something that we should be trying to solve. And if people are only showing up to get gear, that doesn't sound like a good status quo.
First of all, I don't know about that argument specifically. Like someone making an argument that like I would only do it for gear. I would say like at least in the current, the people who are actually playing the most in WoW, it's actually interesting because like we clear and then we just like raid very casually for like the rest of the patch, right? Like the people who spend the most time doing their like raid schedule are like people who are getting cutting edge near the end. The thing is those guilds continue and do that and usually have 278 gear, which is what Mythic drops, far before they are done actually progressing the raid. I think there's a lot of people. I think it's just accessibility with Mythic. I think if you find a team of people you like, I actually don't know how much better content there is than WoW raiding, at least if you like MMO stuff. I think it's just super hard to find a team, keep 20 people happy that like each other, and then obviously the barrier of entry. I think they've done a good job reducing that, and I hope they continue to do it more. Like cross faction will help that immensely. Making Mythic lockouts work like heroic will help immensely. So you don't feel like you're tied. You don't want to go kill, what's the first boss this raid?
Vigilant Guardian.
Yeah, you don't want to go join some group on Skolex because you want your Vigilant Guardian loot for the week. So that person isn't applying to that group who needs a 20th person. And then also cross realm being available from the start. But I don't know if like reducing the amount of people would make that better, because I think raiding in WoW is like really, really sick at all levels. It's I just think specifically in this raid they kind of stepped out of line. And one thing I wanted to mention, because I don't know how much longer you have, Asmon, but I wanted to
5 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to point out a take you had about them designing things with the world first race in mind. From our perspective, anytime, and there's not many times that have been like this, where I feel like that they have actually made changes or done things, and it's because of the world first race, they've almost all ended in disaster or they've been terrible decisions. I'll use an anecdote from this raid. If you remember, they made tier chest and tier shoulders? Is that what drops off of Lords of Dread and Ragallon? I think it is. Those pieces could not drop out of your box for the first week, and like almost verbatim, from what they said, and just in general, they did it so World First Guilds could not attain 4-piece faster than they wanted. And then we were like, that's going to change nothing with what we do. All it's going to do is make it RNG on which one of our players gets 4-piece, but we'll still have 20 in the raid. So it's like a bad decision for us, and it clearly getting 4-piece took way too long this patch. The creation catalyst could have, for the community, the creation catalyst could have solved that, but that could have solved it as well. But the point is that there was an interview with Morgan Day 2 weeks after the race ended, maybe 1 week, and he was talking about how excited he was to go into work on Tuesday and just be like, oh man, it's Mythic Tuesday. How many bosses are going to be dead? I wonder how these guilds are doing. And it blew our mind, everyone involved in this, that anyone at Blizzard who is involved in making decisions because they think they understand the race could have ever thought that we would have done anything other than do splits for multiple days. Because that's just the way they made this patch. And I think their fundamental misunderstanding of really what we're going to do and how it works really makes for some very interesting decision making when they're doing it based on us, but they don't really know what we're going to do or why. The reality is we're always going to do the most degen, time-consuming shit to make ourselves stronger, and almost any decision they could possibly make to mitigate that is just going to end up affecting other people for no reason. And I think a lot of things, especially like removal of Master Loot and things like that, have all come from that. Like when they removed Master Loot, that was their main thing. They were like, he said it in an interview, I want to remove splits. You're never going to remove splits, man.
Well, it's like the thing is that's the way I feel, is I feel like that's a huge problem, because removing Master Loot affects the entire player base, and it's things where a decision is made in order to curtail or to prevent like a 1 or 2% of the player base from playing the game in some way that they consider degenerate. And it's like, where is the value in this? Like, is this really making the game better? If Creation Catalyst came out on release, or it came out pretty much the same time that the game came out, or maybe a week or two after, I think that it would have just been a better experience for average players. And I think that WoW has had an increasingly bigger problem where it tries to cater its content towards the bottom and top 10% of players, and the 80% in the middle, I think those are the people that are going and looking elsewhere to other games, and just kind of drifting away from the game because they see design decisions like this, like these weird convoluted tier trading rules that nobody asked for. Like, why is this even in the game?
It's only
like,
because of the race. That's it.
Yeah.
But the thing is we don't want them to do, like, I'm telling you, like, almost any time they do stuff like that, we don't want them to do that.
Of course not. It makes your life harder. Like, and that's the problem, is like, I think that some people might view like what I've said as like, I am considering like, oh, it's like your fault, it's Limit's fault or Echo's fault that this is happening. I actually think it's the opposite. I think that Blizzard is making the game worse because of the way that you guys want to play the game. And I think if anybody dislikes it, it's going to be you guys, because I'm assuming that whenever you had Master Loot, you probably didn't have to do as many splits, did you? Probably not.
Well, no, back then, but if they brought it back, there would be just as many as there are now, just because there's nothing else to do. But what Personal Loot did was, when Master Loot, you went in there, you had a goal, and you got exactly what you went in to get.
Yeah.
Personal Loot just makes it like this super random RNG, and you're doing all of that work, and it feels like shit because you're doing it for like an extremely inefficient amount of time. That's the thing that makes it feel bad.
Yeah.
Like making 5 of the same character plus kind of thing.
It's weird. It's the same thing that happened at the beginning of Legion 2 with the legendaries, and it's again like them trying to. I think Blizzard oftentimes tries to control player behavior, and it happens at the expense of the players. It's like they see problems that aren't there, and problems that nobody really has except for themselves, and that's what my concern is.
I just quickly want to say, like, one argument that I always bring up whenever people talk about Master Loot, this does not affect like the top end. It also doesn't affect the lower end, but like the mid tier. And that is that Master Loot actually really promotes split rating for mid tier guilds. Because before they removed Master Loot, there was actually a lot of guilds that were like, I would say between top 50 and top 500 that started doing at least one single split raid, which only required one single ult, right? So it wasn't like a huge effort, but it basically doubled the amount of loot you got in Heroic because you could just split your mains into 2 raids, right? And as soon as they introduced personal loot, that stopped. Like mid-tier guilds completely stop doing split raids. And I still think it would be true that if you bring back Master Loot, that this would happen again, that mid-tier guilds either feel the need to do split raids or have a pretty big disadvantage if they don't do it at all. So that is like a slight argument for personal loot, at least for these like mid-tier mythic raiding guilds.
Yeah, I can see that, and I think that's kind of just what's going to happen. I mean, at a certain point, you're always going to have people that will try to take advantage of whatever tool that they have, and that's always it's like, is this really like a big problem though? And I think that's kind of like where like my perspective comes in, is like, let's say 100 or 200 guilds feels like they need to do 2 heroic clears in the first week of a tier. Is this really a reason to completely reimagine the way that a loot system in the game works for 15 years? I feel like, to me, it seems like these are problems that are not really in need of a solution.
Maybe, yeah.
But
well, I think everybody knows how I feel about personal loot. And I will say that to me, one of the most frustrating parts of the loot system in raids is that very often the arguments in favor of master loot come from, I think, the perspective of, I want my raid to do as well as possible. I want the people in my raid, my guild, to be able to do as well as possible. I'm willing to sort of subjugate my desires as an individual player for the collective of the guild, so that the guild can do the best thing possible. And that's cool if raiding is your top priority. But there's a lot of people in this game whose raiding is not their top priority. And like, when I go raid, I'm there for the loot. Like, that's 100%. Like, I've got guildmates I like, it's cool to raid with them and I enjoy it, but like, I'm here to get loot because I'm going to go do Mythic Plus after that. And giving loot to somebody else in the raid might make us clear the raid faster. It doesn't help me do Mythic Plus, which is what I'm here to do. And so I appreciate why you would want to have master loot, but it also comes from a very, like, sort of different perspective than some people in the game have. And it's my primary problem with that raid system is that it's like, I think it's disingenuous to pretend like there aren't a lot of people here just for the loot, and giving that away defeats the entire purpose of why I'm here.
Yeah, I mean, your take is, like, I'm assuming you would never do raids if you could get the best gear in the game from doing Mythic Plus, right?
I mean, I'm like, I don't know, maybe like honestly, I kind of
That's what I
enjoyed
do.
raiding for like the first month of, like, I remember when we were progressing heroic Anduin, I was like, this is a sick fight. Like, I'm enjoying this. Like, this is a fun thing. But I just I get tired of it after a while. If I only ever raided for like the first month and a half, or if it went to farm schedule really quickly and it was just like log in for 4 or 5 hours a week and clear the raid and get your loot and get out of there, I don't think I'd ever have a problem with it. The issue I have is when I find myself in tiers like this, and honestly, I mean, this one's longer than most, but there's always in a guild at my level, which is like World 500, you're always getting to one of these bosses in like the 3rd or 4th month of the tier, and you're like, I'm so fucking done with this. Like, I just want all the bosses to be dead so we can start farming. And this was fun for a couple months, but like, I'm ready to move on.
That's a problem with this raid specifically, though. Like, I think there's a lot of raids that are exactly like that. I think what Blizzard should aim to do when they're designing raids, they should actually completely don't care about the world first race. I don't think that would necessarily trivialize it. I still think it would take about a week or more if they did this, because they've done this well in the past. Is it should be very linear. Like, you should go in a raid, and they should, for the people who clear cutting edge, just cutting edge or a little bit off cutting edge or whatever, like those people who are doing mythic content, every boss you get to should be like a slight thing up from the beginning or from the previous one, and there shouldn't be any like gigantic like walls. Like, I think walls are like, I guess hardcore players like really want them,
I
because
think Siege was a good example of that.
Yeah,
It was very progressive.
But like I feel like hardcore players see bosses like Gorefiend and Painsmith and Ashara, and they're like, yeah, I love a good mid-raid wall. Dude, I think like in general, the community doesn't like those, and I think it turns a lot of people off raiding. I think Painsmith, albeit 9.1, was like probably the worst patch I've ever seen in this game. But like Painsmith murdered guilds because that boss, like, it doesn't make any sense for a boss to be that hard right in the middle of the raid, and then right after that it's a cakewalk, and then you make it to the end. Just kills guilds. That Siege of Orgrimmar is one of the best examples of progressive difficulty through a raid. The most recent version would be Castle Nathru. Castle Nathru is also fantastic with that. It was just almost by the boss, it was slightly harder than the previous one in the way that you went. And they should be tuning it for that. And that also lends well to a good raid for the Race World First. That's exactly what are good raids for us too.
It's anticlimactic. After you kill a boss, it's super hard, and then you just roll over the next two. I do have to go. Thank you guys. I wish I could. I would talk about this for 10 hours. I have to go. Dude. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
good have a good one.
Yeah, see you, man.
See you later.
Yeah, I mean, Painsmith is a good example, like where your guild almost has to be dishonest with itself, where you're like showing up for Painsmith prog, and like nobody wants to say it, but you all know that you're waiting for the nerf. Like it's like, all right, look, we're gonna do some polls, and let's pretend like we have a chance at killing this, but realistically, we all know that there's gonna be like a big round of nerfs that come after Hall of Fame's done, and that's what we're here for. And you can't just stop raiding. Like you can't be like, all right, everybody disappear for a couple weeks, we'll come back when the nerf happens, because then your guild really will die. But at the same time, it sucks showing up to a boss that you know you're not going to kill until the boss gets nerfed. And in this tier has been like the worst. There's like 4 bosses where that's been the case. You get to Halandris and you're like, yeah, when's that nerf coming? And then Anduin, like, okay, the next nerf. And then Rygalon is like, all right, nerf number 4. And we're still joking about jailer nerfs. Like, I don't think they're done nerfing him. Like, I think
no, they aren't done. I
more.
actually had a conversation with the guy at Blizzard via Discord DMs that was like in charge of these nerfs, because he heard like some comments about them on stream, and he wanted to like kind of go through his thought process and see if there was anything else where I thought it was wrong or too much and stuff like that. Because if you've noticed, they're very specific in the last 2 nerfs that they've done. They're targeting like the binary pass fail mechanics, and I think that's the thing that is being glossed over in this raid. That is the reason why this raid is the way it is that the level at which we deal with things like that is just so much higher than the average guild, where things like pure throughput damage and healing and damage intake get smoothed out by gear over time, and those never ever do. And that's just it, and it really slows and halts the progression of guilds. Like, it's weird because like I feel like they should make bosses, and if you don't want to nerf them, you have to make them to be killable by everyone. I don't know how many guilds in this game would it be able to kill the version of Halandris that we killed before their guild died. And it has nothing to do, like, Gear would have almost never nerfed that. It was just kind of binary pass fail. Initial run at Anduin. I think there's a hilarious list. I'll try to find it, of like total nerfs on a boss. If you still look at boss statistics, guilds are like getting up to, like, Halandris is easy now, Lihivum, they kill it, they get to Anduin, and then Anduin is just this hard wall, even after it's been nerfed. I mean, Anduin is by far the most nerfed boss in the history of this game. It's not close. And then after you get past Anduin, they kill the next 2 bosses, and then they're on Jailer, and then like about a 5th of the guilds that are through those 2 bosses after Anduin end up killing Jailer. But Anduin is just that hard, and it's only for that reason. You have to do things at an exactly specific time. If you failed it, and also those are the worst wipes, right? Like, anytime you in a raid are doing a boss, and then randomly your screen flashes and everyone's dead because of something that you had nothing to do with, and in the case of Anduin, you couldn't even see, you know, like upstairs someone misses a CC on a soul and you all just die. It's like, okay, like that's not, like, that's like anti-fun. Same, like, even though like we love progressing Halandris, and my only worry with making a Mythic ultimate difficulty that like never gets nerfed and it's super challenging, the reality is they would have to make fights that are much less difficult than they are now. And I don't know if there is a problem with any of the fights in this raid being too difficult, as much as I thought there was just too many too difficult bosses. Like, there was like 3 bosses in this raid that weren't Jailer that would have been like the absolute hardest second to last boss in like 4 years, and they were all in one raid. Like, that's why this was like this.
Okay, so like there's mechanics in this raid that I feel like are the epitome of things I hate in raid, like mechanics that I hate in raid. And one that we just, I'm still progging Jailer. One that I despise that's on Jailer right now is the lines, the mind control lines, because not only does it require everyone in the raid to have a certain amount of personal responsibility, it's also so easy to lie about it. Like you just make shit up if you fail it. Like somebody moved at the last second. I was standing in the right spot and like some other guy moved. And it's so difficult to like prove that you can't go into like Warcraft logs replay and like pull that up and see where like the lines necessarily were coming from and figure out if it actually hit somebody. You just have to take people at their word. And that's the kind of stuff that you can't even like hold someone's hand through that kind of thing. You can't develop the perfect strat for how to solve that. You just have to wait for everybody to play better. And there is no more frustrating answer to how to deal with a mechanic than just everybody needs to play better. That you can't go copy someone's like strat or positioning or timings. Everyone has to be a better player than they were last poll. And you know that they probably won't be. And it's like, oh my God, like this is hell. Like, we're never going to kill this boss like this. And there's nothing I can do to fix that.
Yeah, I do think though that like obviously Sepulcher was like an outlier for sure, right? First of all, the kind of passive nerf through gear didn't really happen, so they had to actively nerf all the bosses. But I do think that in the last couple of tiers, or maybe even the last like 2 or 3 expansions, it kind of became more obvious that the tuning they have to do at the start of the raid is quite a bit higher than what it ends up being at the end. Sometimes it happens through gear and through active nerfs, and sometimes, this shit happens like we have it in Sepulcher, where it's mainly through active nerfs and it's like much more obvious. But I do think I have been paying attention to how bosses have been when I killed them for the first time, and how they have been when I killed them like at the very end of the patch. And I do think it's drastically just getting bigger and bigger, the kind of nerfs that they have to do. And I do think that is technically not necessarily an issue, right? Because people always say, if Jailer is this hard, that it doesn't really matter for someone who is not going to reach that boss until like a couple of weeks in, or even like a month or 2 in. And I agree, but I think it definitely has like a psychological effect where if you know that the boss is going to be unkillable for you until it gets nerfed, like JB just said with Painsmith, right? Where okay, we don't have to reach this boss just yet because we have to wait for nerfs anyway, right? So it kind of demotivates you to even progress further into the raid because you know that there's going to be bosses that are just too hard for you in its current state. And I think even if you won't even reach the boss before it gets nerfed, I still think it kind of demotivates you, and it's just like weighs the whole raid down, knowing that this current version is just too hard for your guild.
Yeah, I also think I kind of wanted to like talk about season 4 as well, because I think season 4, at least in rating, is going to. I think season 4 is a brilliant idea, but I think one of the coolest things that they're doing is they're using it as kind of a petri dish. Just like mess around, experiment, do whatever you want to like kind of figure out what's good. You can tell that they're doing that. They're putting affixes in raids. They're having a raid rotation. They're retuning old raids for the first time ever, for like current gear, and they're also messing around with loot. So like loot is like, you guys are talking about like the hardest way to get loot. Like I can like raid this much and I'm just looking for these items so I can do the other thing. They're implementing something in the patch that allows you to like basically choose items from a raid even if you never get it to drop, kind of thing. And the reason they're doing it is because the raids are this spread out and you're only getting to do like one a week, right? And it's possible now to clear a raid the entire season and never get a piece to drop. That happens. But like with this, they're saying, you're going to see the raids even less, we'll give it to you. But I think it's something they could add to pretty much every season in some aspect, with them removing bonus roll coins and them having really no system to target gear that you want. And I wonder, especially JB, what you think about that specifically, because I think that would also be a way, if they don't do other stuff, to bridge the gap between rating for gear and rating because you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would have helped very much if this system had existed, or if the season 4 system had existed this season. I don't think it would have helped very much because of the sheer amount of 285 gear that existed in the raid, and that was adding a third boss that dropped higher eye level loot than you could get from other content. Like really punished people that weren't raiding, because now there's literally over half the slots on my character that have a 285 piece that I would use. I mean, not just like, yeah, there's technically a 285 trinket, but it's dog shit and I wouldn't use it. There's like 285 slots in over half the things that I would equip if I could. So I don't even think being able to target a few things would have necessarily solved that. But it is really nice for, if that would have existed in like season 1 or season 2, I think that would have been a lot better. And that's just in that instance because there was less really good loot from the raid. And if I could have picked like 3 pieces, that would have made me feel like I got most of what I wanted out of the raid. I will say I don't think there will ever be a raid loot system short of moving raid loot to like heroic so that it's much more easily.
I mean, for
accessible.
you, I mean, you get like 278 gear pretty quick though. Like, I feel like if there literally just was not 285 gear, if there was not the increased eye level off of the last 2 bosses, then your issue with this would be massively reduced, right?
Yeah, if everything in the raid was 278, or the like just the last boss had like 285 gear on it, if it was just like a few pieces, that would be a much smaller deal. But this tier in particular, it just feels like, and it's like a very weird tier because I feel like it's never been easier to get a sort of baseline amount of loot than it is right now with like uncapped valor. You can, I mean, there's players making like new characters and like a week later they're like 275 eye level. But going from like 275 to BIS takes so long for anybody that's not, I mean, even people that are doing the raid. But with the amount of like extending that your more mid-tier guilds are doing, like I haven't re-killed a boss in a month and a half. I haven't gotten raid loot out of my vault since like
Oh, because you're in the extend train.
yeah, because we hit
Oh,
Halandris
fuck.
and it's just
Yeah.
we killed
That's a
Halandris,
problem.
extend.
I think
extend.
they've
Oh,
had to
That's the same
address
issue.
that. I think they've had to address that for a while. Like guilds are really like forced. If you raid like 2 or 3 days a week, there's just a certain point in pretty much every patch. This raid is probably the worst, but like there's a certain point in every patch where you just start extending and not getting your vault and raid loot, and it definitely sucks huge ass. I don't know how they could fix that honestly, but it's a problem.
But I
We
would love
killed
to see a currency system from raids. Sorry, that's
Yeah.
where I was driving towards is, and I know that's probably like a lot of people probably recoil in horror at that idea, but I would love to see like a valor system for raiding and really across like all loot, where I think that it solves some of the like split rating problem, where basically you get a certain allotment of like gear currency every week. It doesn't matter how you like split up the raid or how many different splits you do. Your character can only get so much loot in the form of currency each week, and then over time you just get to pick what you want, and everyone gets the gear that they want at the same rate as each other. I mean, maybe you could do, I don't necessarily have a problem with like speeding up gear acquisition by doing multiple forms of in-game content, but I don't think one should reward better gear than the others.
I think I like the whole currency idea, and they're also implementing something similar, right? Where you have the vendor and you can choose certain items. I saw the vendor earlier on PTR. It only has trinkets and weapons, so it has nothing else than that. And I personally would suggest that they should do the opposite. Of course, not when you rotate the raids like they do in season 4, but if you have a normal raid here where there's only one raid, I would suggest that you do have these kind of like valor points, but you put rings and necks and cloaks and that kind of stuff onto a vendor. Because let's be honest here, the reason why gear still drops from the raid is because people kind of want that like dopamine when they see an item that drops, right? So having only valor points would kind of take away from that. But if you kill a boss and you get an item and it's a ring or a neck or a cloak that you've already looted 50 times and the rest of your guild has looted it 50 times already, then you're not happy, right? So if they would only put important items onto actual drops, like weapons, trinkets, and whatever, it would first increase the chance of you actually getting those items because necks and rings wouldn't like clutter the loot table. And you just go to that vendor and buy whatever ring you want, and you don't have to loot 50 of them during your whole progression, right?
I cannot imagine a thing that would crush my soul more than being able to buy everything except the pieces that I want off of a vendor. That's
I
like
mean,
the
he'll have to
opposite of
raid.
the system that I want. That is the antithetical to what I'm looking for from the raid. I want to just buy all the good shit from the vendor, and then we can go and raid. Like if the only thing that dropped from like Lords and Ragalon and Jailer was like cloaks and necks and whatever, then yeah, fuck it, extend for 4 months in a row. I don't care.
But wouldn't it be you need to raid anyway to get the points, right? So instead of you getting the valor from the bosses, you just already get the items as you're doing it. And
Yeah,
then
I
you buy
mean-
the rings afterwards, right? Like it doesn't. It's like the same thing technically.
I hear this argument that like a lot of the excitement of killing a boss is like seeing what drops off of it, and I just maybe
I'm like
weird.
totally not there for that.
Yeah, I don't.
That
I don't
doesn't
No.
exist. That doesn't exist for me at all. Yeah, but
Well, I do think it exists for a lot of players, though. I think
I
that's
mean,
also a
I
big
want
reason
the
why the
loot.
whole legendary thing in Legion worked out pretty well. Because
Yeah,
people
like
were just kind of happy about the legendaries just popping up randomly.
I do love loot, but I don't necessarily care how I get it. Like
Yeah, I know. I
dropping
see
off a
your
boss-
point.
It dropping off a boss is no different than me going and buying it off a vendor. And in some
Yeah.
ways, buying it off a vendor is kind of nice because I can take my time, I can stare at it for a little bit, I can build anticipation, I can wait for everybody in stream, like, guys, we're gonna buy my best weapon, get in here. And that there's like a moment of appreciation. Whereas a lot of times it's almost like too much excitement when you kill a boss and then you get the loot you wanted. Like now I can't even appreciate those things independently. It's like having your birthday on Christmas. Like you've taken two good things and put them together, and I would have enjoyed more of them, like more of each of those things if they'd occurred separately. I could have enjoyed the boss kill, reveled in that a bit, and then at a later date gone in and gotten my best loot and had a lot of enjoyment again at that. But now the two things have been combined, and I was already at like maximum enjoyment of killing the boss. I'm already excited, and now I've gotten loot, and it like cheapens that a little bit. So yeah, I would definitely be down for a vendor system. I know there's a lot of people that are like, oh, it would make it too like clinical if you could buy it off a vendor, but I think I would like to see them do it for one season just to see. And I would have liked to have seen season 4 for them to get like weirder than they're getting. I would have
Really?
loved to have seen them just scrap like all that we know of rating and just like that's where I think you should have done. You know, unlike giving the community a poll for like what dungeons you want to see in the Mythic Plus rotation, I would have loved to have seen them be like, give us your craziest ideas and we're gonna draw the top 50 of those from a hat and we're gonna put those in and just see. You know, like this season's already kind of a throwaway thing, and let's just try out a bunch of crazy shit, and like we don't necessarily expect it to work, but if something does resonate.
No. I mean, first of all, I think they actually are going to experiment more in season 4 than I think a lot of people are prepared for, especially with like the main topic today being like Mythic raid difficulty, right? Like faded raids are going to be the new Mythic raids in this patch. I want to actually hear something from you guys. I think these raids are going to be very easy, and I think they should be.
I agree.
They've already said that they've stated that they don't want this to be like a competitive thing. They've never really said that before, so that like kind of stuck out to me. And here's another thing. Anyone in anyone's chat right here, I think JB's streaming and I'm streaming. Has anyone here raided in a 2-day or 3-day raiding guild before, where there are sometimes 3 or 4 days between your last raid?
I do.
rated 2. I rated 2 days.
So you know that feeling where when you progress on a boss, and this is including you extending, by the way, where you progress on a boss and then you take 4 days off, you go back to that boss and you start regressing and wiping to the same things you wiped to in the previous raid, because there has been so much time away from the raid that a lot of people in your raid just got out of the flow of it and it's not on the top of their mind, and they have to spend the first like hour of raid, you know, kind of getting back into it and becoming good at the boss again. All right, well, in season 4, let's just say the first week of season 4, maybe it starts 2 weeks later, who knows, you're going to get like, let's say Castle Nathria, and it's going to be the fights that you haven't done in a year, and they're going to have an extra affix on top of them. I'm not sure if it's been publicly said of like what they are, but like I can kind of explain a few of them if people are interested after this. But you're going to be doing that, but not only is it going to be 3 days between your raid, it's going to be probably 3 weeks until this raid is pullable again on faded difficulty. And it might even be, hasn't been stated yet, with different affixes, right? And then it's also coming off of the fact that Blizzard very normally overreacts to things. They overreact. I can give a bunch of examples from the past, but I think with how hard Sepulcher was and how short the season's going to be, I think season 4 is going to be out in probably sometime at the end of next month, beginning of August. And I think they nerfed this raid so much, it was too hard. So few people did it. I think they're going to overswing in the other direction and make this, and I think they should do this, make this extremely accessible to everyone who plays this game, because I think that's the thing that people are crying out for right now. And if you're talking about season 4 being an experiment, that's what I think they're going to experiment with. I think if these raids are not clearly doable by 2 and 3 day guilds in that week that did get cutting edge in Castle Nathria or are working on getting it in this current raid, I think they will very, very quickly nerf it.
I really just don't see how this is going to work out for those fewer rating guilds, because heroic already drops much higher item level than what we have right now, right? So you're just going to spend 1 day doing heroic, even if it is easy-ish on the heroic version. You would still need, I would say, like 2 or 3 hours to get through the raid. And then you start doing Mythic, and then you only have, if you're a 2-day raiding guild, you only have like 4 or 5 hours left. And then you need to clear the whole raid. Like, I don't think that's feasible. So
Well,
that's why I think it's going to be really weird.
This will be certainly a very interesting take, because there shouldn't be much learning involved anymore. Everyone or at least everybody that's rated so far this tier, like maybe this expansion, maybe the new affixes will shake the boss fights up a bit, but you should know how all the bosses work. It's been a while since you've pulled them. You'll have to knock the rust off, but there's no like learning how the bosses work. And so that should speed up progress, quote unquote, I think pretty dramatically on all of these. But to Max's point, I'll be pissed if this isn't like turbo loot season, because I have spent the last like 4 months just banging my head on the wall trying to clear this raid. And if they give me like a month and a half to farm loot, and then immediately transition into the next tier after all of this soul-sucking progress, the next season that we're transitioning into had better just be like raining loot the whole time. This better be the makeup for
I think it will be
season 3. And if that's the case, then I'll consider it, kind of even. But if they make this one hard too, I'm gonna be pissed. Like this, I had better just get all the loot that I didn't get this tier.
I think Blizzard would be an absolute fool to make the hardest. So you're saying like heroic faded or mythic faded or whatever. I think they would be fools to make it like super giga hard again. And like I said, they kind of have already said that they don't really want to. Not to mention that they haven't really been clear on this, but I imagine we're getting the nerfed versions of these bosses. I don't think you're gonna, on Mythic Faded, you're going to be pulling, 10-second bomb Halandris again, for example, right? It's gonna be the current versions of these bosses across all the nerfs throughout the expansion. But like some of the affixes work kind of like this, for example. I'll just read off two that are very easy to understand. There's 5 of them. Creation Spark debuffs a target, causing them to take damage every 3 seconds for 30 seconds. So just a dot. On expiration, it shoots out multiple sparks. It must be soaks. Soaking does a hit of damage, but increases all a bit of damage, but increases all haste by 10% and movement speed by 15% for 20 seconds stacking, and that stacks up to 3. And then that's just like kind of going on during all these fights throughout the season. Another one. Summons a mob that begins a 30-second cast that does 800k raid-wide damage. Interacting with it stops the cast, but causes it to generate motes for 15 seconds. These motes fixate a new target every 3, channel damage into them until it's killed. Killing it splits into new motes. After 15 seconds, it all despawns, and the raid is buffed with 2% damage and healing done per mote killed for 25 seconds. And you can, because it's a 30-second cast, you can kind of like choose when you want to kill it. So those
it's
are just
a Starfall affix.
Yeah. So like multiple of these affixes, and you don't know if they're going to be like per boss or per raid week. Like if like during this week, Castle Nathria will all have Creation Spark, or the second one I mentioned was Chaotic Essences. But all of them are meant to like be difficult to deal with potentially, but then also buff you. Right, so like you're getting buffs and like potentially huge damage buffs before like a Sludge Fist burn phase or something. So like I really feel like there's going to be strats and ways to make these pretty doable. But it also mentions that the hard part of these fights is like going to be dealing with these affixes, I think, and that's why I don't think they're going to try to make the actual base raids very, very difficult. I think this season will be loot pinata season, and I think the community wants it a lot, and it kind of begs the question, and I wanted to answer this earlier. This is actually a Yumi TV. This is a Growl take. Would the game be better or worse, JB, if on the very first day of this season you just had full BIS?
So I have to take a step back here, because I recognize that my preferences in this game are fairly divergent from, I think, the average player. I would be thrilled if I woke up one day and Blizzard was like, we've just made every server a tournament realm. There is no more loot progression or any of that shit. Like, you just have all of your best gear all the time. You can pick whatever you want. You can, craft any amount of legendaries you want. That, you just have everything immediately. I would love that, and I would not stop playing. Like, I think there's a concern among the community that if you had instant loot, a lot of people would be like, well, there's no reason for me to log in anymore. That was the only reason I played the game, was to like get this gear, and I have it, and all my motivation's gone. I'm going to log out till next season. I recognize that's probably true for a lot of people. Like, I'm not trying to dismiss that. That is probably the case. There are probably a lot of people out there that exist like that.
Yeah, this is a very controversial take.
I would play all the time and love it all the more for it, for having all my best gear right off the bat. I don't like that part of the game.
See, this is like where a lot of other games influence, like, kind of see that. So I think the best example of like how that could go is like Diablo 3, right? Like, if anyone's played a Diablo 3 season in the last 5 years, what happens is you log in, and this is what 99% of people do. Log in with the boys on Friday, go in and get your loot. You get like your full set and all your pieces, and then you spend like a day getting a decent amount of like ancient drops with like good itemization, and then as soon as it starts taking you multiple hours before you're getting an upgrade, you always quit. And if you were to just log in on the first day with perfect ancient gear, you would just play, like, maybe push a high rift, and you'd play for a day and you would stop. Right now, Diablo 3 is a completely different game, but what you can say about WoW over the course of time, you mentioned this earlier, actually before you were in the call, is that gear in WoW, like, every decision you make, most decisions a player makes throughout the beginning of a season to the end of the season, is just about acquiring gear. Your like road to acquiring gear over time is like basically determines what you're doing and like why you're doing it. Where there's also obviously a set of players like you who gear is just there to be there, and I really just want to like push high keys, or some people want to raid, Mythic raid. Right. So I think like finding out exactly, because like games change over time and player bases change over time. And maybe one of the things WoW has really struggled with is just a problem of being an almost 20-year-old game. Is back in the day, people played this game for a much more unified reason. And now there are legit factions of people who play this game, probably 6 or 7 or 8 of them, that play it hardcore or casual, but they play it for specifically that reason. And it is impossible to make them all happy. And I like, they can't really do many major things like what you're suggesting without alienating a few or one of them. And I don't know why, if anything would change because of that.
Well, I think the easiest solution I have for that is tournament realms, like year round as an opt-in kind of experience. And I think there are enough guys like me. Like, if you gave me a tournament realm and you assured me that there would be at least enough people on it that I could find a group to do keys with at any point in time. Like, my biggest fear would be I'd show up and there'd be like 6 other people on the server and it'd be like, fuck. But if there were at least enough people that I was confident that I could continue doing keys, kind of on a daily basis on that tournament realm, I would never look back. And I feel like a server like that's kind of sandboxed off on its own. You could like remove all the achievements and shit from it. I don't care. Having something that's off by itself like that would allow me to play the game exactly the way I want to play it, where I can just have my gear and then I can do the content I want to do, and to my heart's content, and without bothering like other players. And I'm not entirely sure why Blizzard hasn't ever given an option like that, why there hasn't been
Chad,
like
I put
a
a poll
tournament
up.
realm server that's just like, if that's why you play this game, is to do the content and not kind of eschewing all of the RPG elements of the game, but rather I want to treat it essentially like an esport, which I recognize is like not what WoW is supposed to be. Like, that's not how most people view the game. That's not why most people play the game. But it is how I enjoy the game, and I feel like I can provide a solution for that, like a conceptual solution for how to let me enjoy the game like that without ruining it for other players. And I feel like it's weird that we've never gotten at least an attempt, especially, in this age of releasing like classic, like Blizzard showing a willingness to give players what they asked for and see what happens, like I would love to see a permanent tournament realm where I can just I'd even pay more for it. I'd do like another sub.
I have a question though. Would you play on that tournament realm exclusively if Raider.io and all of the kind of score would not actually work?
Yes. Yeah. Fuck Raider. Okay. Look,
I
I love
think-
Raider.io.
Dude,
there would
JB,
not be
JB,
enough people.
Yo,
You
hold
would
up.
be alone on
Yeah,
that server.
Yeah, JB, I think
And I know. Even among the Mythic Plus community, I'm sure this is weird.
Yeah.
But like all that I care about is challenging myself. Like I just want to go.
Yeah,
do
I get
these
it.
that are
I don't
hard.
think WoW is for people like that though. Almost exclusively.
And I know. I've been made abundantly aware of that in my time on social
Yeah, I
media.
mean, I even just did a poll in my channel about, and keep in mind, my channel are like, well, they're all high IQ geniuses for sure, but also they're like super high IO, like super Mythic Raider dudes, and they're like definitely like my polls always bias away against casual players who would completely disagree with you. And so they're more likely to agree with you, and they were not fans of that take. They didn't like that take, but yeah.
I know. I have to like for all of the weird shit that you see on Twitter, where like I say what I'd like to see with the game. Recognize that's still only like 20% of the way towards where I would actually like to see the game. But I just recognize that beyond that 20% that I share on Twitter, I just get out into a zone where I know that there's 5 other people in the world that agree with me. And I've tried to make my peace with the fact that the way I would like to play WoW is not the way WoW is ever going to be, or even probably a little bit like the way it's going to be. So I have to kind of like pick my battles.
I mean, what you're saying though is like something that people have like mentioned with Raid though. Like there were definitely some turbo cooked takes about the race world first, like in the last 2 years, where they're like, just put the race on a tournament realm and like just have it do its own thing. And like all those takes are really dog shit. Like they would never make sense for the game. It like kind of takes away from what makes the race world first a unique community run event that's different than a lot of esports, right? So
Yep.
I think so. There's probably more people that have talked about this in regards to rating, and even I don't think that would necessarily be good. I mean, it could have benefits, I guess, if it meant that they stopped making decisions for the entire game, trying to make this work and function like that on live realms. But yeah, I don't know if that would actually work.
I think there, and that's the part of all of this that I wouldn't mind seeing from Blizzard. And I hesitate here because I've had conversations with Blizzard employees where they've told me things that surprise me in terms of like what is and is not possible to do on their servers. They're like, yeah, that's a really good idea. There's no fucking way we could ever implement that. Our engine doesn't support that, whatever. But I would love to see servers with different like rule sets.
While he's ripping this take chat,
where you're not just
y'all
getting,
throw your Crocs in
like
sport
right
mode?
now in World of Warcraft, if you're on retail, every server
Or do
is
you keep that shit
the
relaxed?
same server just with a different name and a different like population, but they all work the same. I would love to see with the however many servers we have out there, like hundreds of servers, I would love to see some where you have different like increased XP gain, or the ability to like buy stuff off vendors, like all of your gear off vendors, or just come up with some stuff that's like a little bit different, that if you appreciate different aspects of the game, you can go to those servers that have different rule sets, and they can even kind of section those off. Like you could have different ladders for different, maybe you're not comparing Raider.io or Hall of Fame,
Dude, chat.
Across every server.
would literally
you would
never
have your
fucking work.
subsets in the same way that they had the battle groups or whatever back in the day, that you could have battle groups for different rule sets, and you would say like, yeah, I've got the rank 1 Mythic Plus score, but it's for this battle group, and maybe there'd be, I don't know, 4 or 5 of those battle groups. So again, I
just need to laugh so much
I get it.
because THD is in chat and he's like, a server with AP.
Yes, and that look.
Oh no.
Good, I'm here for you. Let's do an AP server. You can have that
no.
in my utopia. You can have that.
I mean, one thing about your utopia that it does address, though, is kind of what I was talking about, where there are definitely, like, I'm just going to make up a number, like 4 to 5 different giant groups of people that all want something completely different from the game.
Yeah.
So in your utopia, all those people have their own version of WoW. The reality is that would never happen, so there's no point. But
No, I recognize, like, you know, I'm daring to dream right now, and I know that this stuff is super unlikely to ever happen. But it's the kind of stuff that, like, in some ways, Blizzard is playing with fire in season 4 in doing this kind of weirder season where they're like, oh, let's try some stuff, and I'm like, oh, you want to try some stuff? Well, hang on, I have some shit I'd really like you to try. And by showing a willingness to kind of get out of their comfort zone, and I feel like there's been a lot of that in general in Shadowlands. Like, the Blizzard has shown that they are more receptive to player feedback, I think, in this last year.
not even in the last year. I think the major turning point was 9.5, which I think was like 8 months or something, 7 months ago. That was where, and this had never happened before, you saw them actually be like, yeah, this was bad, and then they immediately implemented a thing to fix it. Where that process actually didn't happen. You, like, the account wide everything,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff.
Target cap removal, my jaw hit the floor when I saw that tweet come through where they were like, yeah, we're removing target cap, and I was like, I would have bet any amount of money in the world coming into this expansion that there was no way in hell that the target cap was being removed until at least next expansion.
Oh, that was my take too, because like I thought that was like, I saw it as just basically the exact same thing as them putting GCDs on offensive abilities, and it's like, yeah, we complained about it the whole expansion, but it's just one of those things where they're just gonna wait until next expansion to fix it.
Yep.
And yeah, I was definitely very surprised. I mean, I'm pretty sure I was on record saying that there was no chance they were gonna do it, because that's just how they are, and I was wrong. So
Same.
Yeah, I'm sure the same words came out of my mouth at some point. Like, there's no fucking way that they removed target cap this expansion.
I do quickly want to ask a question because we talk about season 4 and like the trying out stuff. They're trying the raids with affixes, right? And I was wondering if you guys would be interested. I know JB probably isn't. Actually, maybe. Maybe he would be. What would you think if they try something like a boss rush mode where you are raiding, but you don't have the trash in between? It's only a set amount of bosses, let's say 4 or 5, and maybe they are even from like any raid, like maybe one from Castle Nathria and then one from different raid, and it scales up like in Plus. But maybe, I'm not sure if affixes would work for that, but
no,
basically
yeah.
just like an infinite
it's like-
scaling raid mode.
No, it's like Boss Rush from Lost Ark, except it's actually difficult and not a daily chore, and you would just keep. And those dungeons can be like, or those bosses would be dungeon bosses. They could be like really souped up, like random rares out in the world, shit like that. And then you just, and I guess it's like kind of RNG what bosses you get together, and you do it with a smaller amount of people.
I was thinking that it actually is raid size. So like maybe like 10.
I think if you're incorporating any new mode in an MMO in 2022, it cannot be 20 players. I just don't think. I just think.
10.
I really think it would just be so much more accessible. Yeah, 10's fine, but like, and I understand the difficulties in WoW with that, mainly being as there's just so many different specs, and unlike other games, they're not giga homogenized. Like, they all do very, very different shit. So, like, you know, like reducing group size usually makes it like weird, and it makes like certain classes way too good and necessary, and you never actually see, you know, like for example, especially with druids getting Mark of the Wild, there's almost 10 classes with like insane raid buffs. So like, how can you make a 10-man when like that's basically you have exactly the classes you need right there, right? So
I still can't believe they gave Druid Mark of the Wild. Like, that's just...
Yeah, me either. That's crazy.
I mean, I'm a Druid, so I'm biased, but even I think that it's stupid to give Druid a raid buff when they have 4 different specs.
Let's get back to that thing you were talking about earlier. So on that point, actually, I'm curious to get your guys' take on this. So you mentioned having scaling raids, and I don't know how you guys would feel about having raids that scale
Did we mention
in the
scaling
same way
raids?
that like Mythic Plus does, where the idea would be to give sort of season-long content to raiders, because
sorry, I
one thing
zoned
you see with World First raiders is like they clear the raid, and then like as Max said, they like take the rest of the tier off. I mean, like they still raid, they still have guys that like to go raid, and they still need gear and whatnot, so you'll come back in and do a more casual raid schedule. But that like that excitement for the rating is like gone at that point. Like once the final boss is dead, it's kind of like, all right, we're on sort of mini vacation until the next tier comes out. Do you think it would be a well-received idea to create raids where you could go back in and like keep challenging yourself throughout the season, like to keep making the bosses
No.
Yeah,
more and more difficult?
No, I don't think
that's
so.
what I mean with like the scaling.
Yeah.
Well, but
Right,
I
right?
assumed like the boss rush was just like a totally different thing, but like no, I just think this like I don't know who you're targeting that for. Like people, is it like a post Mythic thing? Like you feel like, oh, you've cleared Mythic, well that's cool. So here's like, you know, you can keep making it harder. I feel like if they were gonna ever do that, they would have to massively reduce the overall skill level required to kill Mythic, and then the skill expression would be in going higher in the scaling mode. It would be like there's no way you could do it now. Like if like it was like, oh, who's ready to fucking queue up? Sepulcher's a terrible example for this, but like fucking scaled Sepulcher, all of the like 200 fucking people that want to do this, you know, or I guess 1,000 people that have killed the raid so far. Like it's not enough people to implement a mode like that. But all of that would have to come, and all of that is possible once they kind of decide what they're doing with loot. Like the current loot model doesn't really let them do that. But if they make the ability to get best loot much faster and much more accessible to players, then they can start playing around with the difficulty modes at the top a lot more. Because I think currently it'd be really hard to do that.
Well, I just don't. I'm never really sure how the kind of top end raid community feels about raiding in terms of, you know, like with Mythic Plus, the entire season is something that you enjoy, like that you are there to do keys and you never necessarily stop wanting to do keys. There's not a point where you're like, all the important keys have been finished and I'm just waiting for next season. I don't know if there are raiders out there that wish that raiding was more like that, sort of independent of boss design, but that they wished that like raiding was important all season long, or if as a format raiding almost requires you to step away from it for a while before the next
I
season
think
comes out.
already 80 to 90% of raiders raiding is already important all season long because they're progressing the entire time.
You're probably right. Yeah.
That's all. Like they would just have to change. They would just have to change the way that raiding is done, basically, for that to be a thing.
They could technically just turn the old raid into the scaling mode, right? Where they say, okay, Sepulcher is coming out in 9.2? And the previous patch's raid is just going to be scalable now. And the items that drop there are maybe scaled up, but not like to the current level. Maybe just like Mythic Plus level. Like the ones that drop, not the one that you can upgrade. So you kind of have like an extra way of getting initial gear. And then later on, if you want to do it on higher levels, like infinite scaling or whatnot, then you just do it for fun and not necessarily to get gear, which I'm not sure how many people would do that, but just as an option, I guess.
Well, I guess as a more specific question then, like for Max, what do you wish there was a way that you could basically keep your guild doing raid content all year round, or does that sound like a nightmare?
No, that sounds good, but it would only be for like people like us, and I think maybe, like I said, you're talking like tops like 1,000 total people, not even guilds, like a couple hundred guilds that would do this, and I just think that's such a small population to consider that. However, I think maybe you might be able to see them, because like something I've thought about a bit about Dragonflight, and I think we can kind of talk about Dragonflight at least for a bit, is with them making it so the like main thing of the expansion is not some new thing they're creating that takes 2 years to be good. It's like an evergreen talent system that's like kind of exists for all of it, and I'm sure there'll like be some like perks and shit like that throughout the expansion for ways they're going to do it. But have you guys thought about it all, how like 10.1, 10.2 and 10.3 are going to innovate with them taking a little bit of a step back from just adding borrowed power systems that are different every patch? I think what you could see them do is maybe actually, for the first time since Mythic Plus, actually look to kind of innovate the main game modes of the game more, because I think they'll have a lot more time to do that. So I think conversations like that are actually pretty good, because I think they could actually innovate more and do that. So like, yeah,
But to be honest, though, I think just in the way that Mythic 0 is a, literally Mythic difficulty dungeon is can be done by like animals, right? Like actual dogs. You would need to make the baseline Mythic difficulty much easier, and then if you're going to do anything scaling wise, yes, you would have more fun, and every week you did farm, it would be a longer thing throughout the course of a season. But yeah, you'd be invested for more time, but like the actual base level up front, like Mythic raid, would not be as interesting. And it's also a lot of people's time too. Like a 20-man raid pushing, like imagine like a 20-man pushing keys. Like I think that kind of play definitely thrives with the 5-player group size. So
Yep.
I don't know if something like that would actually work. But anyways, I want a hard caveat because we are getting some fucking bong cloud takes about systems and shit. So talent trees. So both of you guys play a class that has had a talent tree mock-up released. So I want to hear your all's takes on them. I've only talked about it on myself. I'm actually a huge fan of them. It'll obviously take work, but I want to hear your all's takes on them.
Oh, new talent tree is so good. It's the thing I've probably been most excited about in WoW since Mythic Plus. Like I don't know how many people played Rift, the MMO, when it first came out, but it had like a shitload of talent trees and different classes that like each class had its own talent tree, and then you could select like multiple classes at the same time, and so then you had like multiple talent trees, and I could sit. That's like how I passed time between classes. Is I would like sit on my laptop and just fuck around with talent trees for like an hour at a time, just trying out different combinations of stuff. And I love that level of kind of being able to innovate with your character and pick and choose what you want. And I recognize that that's probably scary for some players of the game to have that much freedom to like fuck your class up, but I think that for people that like, it's one of my favorite things in WoW is to try to think of new things, whether that's like new routes in a dungeon or new combinations with legendaries or something. Just like be trying to think of new things to do and try them out and experiment. Like that's what I probably have most fun in WoW doing. And talent trees open up, I feel like, hopefully a ton of room for that to just get kind of weird.
Yeah, I think it's insane. I've heard of the community things so far that I've heard about it, like just random. In fact, when they released these, I was at DreamHack and then I instantly went to Europe for 2 weeks, so I probably missed a ton of takes about this. But I've heard people saying it's like some classes are really like you have to, your build is like kind of there and you just go get it. And you don't have to make a lot of harsh decisions. And then there's other classes where it's like, man, I have to make some weird decisions and take this like weird talent to get what I want. Like the Frosty K tree literally is like you go down the right side of it and it's just all howling, blasty, remorseless winter AoE shit. And then the left side is all like a blitz single target shit. And it's like every decision you're making to get something makes sense. The node you had to get to the thing you want also goes with what you want. And then I think the Moonkin tree has like some weird choices, right? Where like you have to take like to get like the full AoE setup, the thing that's like on the way there is the thing that puts your Starfall on a cooldown. And it's like there's like some stuff like that that's weird. And I really wonder how that's gonna work for tuning, because the thing that I've heard from people, and I actually don't know if I agree with this, is they're like, you have to spend too many points just to get your base kit. And then my only response to that is, if you only have to choose between a few different things, isn't that what talent trees are now? Like if there's only like a very small amount of decisions you make, isn't that like basically the row of things outside of them basically in this scenario jumbling the talent trees a little bit, and you can get some things right now that are on the same row that have like crazy combos you haven't seen before. But like I just want to know what you guys think about that.
Yeah, I do think that talent trees are great. First of all, like I looked at it and I immediately thought that the idea behind it is great. For example, I think specifically Druid, and that's also why they chose to show it first, probably, is Druid having 4 specs. Yeah. And generally having a lot of utility across those 4 specs, a lot of different abilities. So it's this huge tree, and like a Moonkin can go Skull Bash, and a Restorer can have Skull Bash, and you can have all of these like bear abilities or cat abilities or rest abilities, right? So it's this huge kind of tree with all of these choices you can make. And yeah, sometimes it feels like you're like wasting a bunch of points to get base abilities for your own spec, and then you also need to waste like a bunch of points into useless abilities to get something that you want. But I think those choices are like, they're not bad, right? I think it's okay to make these kind of decisions, to be like, oh, I'm gonna waste a bunch of points here to get this really cool ability that I want for this specific fight or for this specific dungeon. And I mean, how many points do we have once we are max level?
Like 30 and
I think the ones that were the mock-ups that were linked, the calculators you could play with had the amount you could do. It was like, it's 31 and 30, I think.
yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, so if you have 60 like points in total in both trees, then I think it's totally fine if you waste a bunch of points into abilities that you're used to already having as like a baseline thing, right? Even if you waste like 40 points, you still have 20, which is a lot more talent points than what we have right now, right? So I
No,
think that is totally okay.
and you can get, and it's just going to be fresh because you can choose things you haven't been able to choose before. But one thing I've heard from people is they're like, oh yeah, it's going to be like you're making all these like crazy decisions all the time. I want to warn people against that, because I think, yes, that is the idea, but you know, you're not actually going like PoE is the best example of this. PoE is the game with like the infinite builds, and you guys have all seen the picture of that giant fucking confusing talent tree, that like the Atlas tree, whatever the fuck it's called, and like you just like select whatever like thing you want. People are like, oh my god, there's so much choice, and it's like, yeah, maybe for someone that is like making that build, but like, let's be real, like 90, almost all of you dudes just copy someone's build who figured it out. Like that like cool creative process of figuring it out in today's day and age is going to be done by someone, uploaded to YouTube or some website or forum, and then people are going to just use that thing. So that like cool creative process doesn't actually apply to a lot of people. I think that's what they have to really work on doing. They have to put themselves in a position where like player A is doing fight, and it's not like he just copy pasted Icy Veins or whatever, and he's like, oh yeah, well, this is the, you know, this is the single target with interrupt plus like 3-minute lust or something like thing like that. Like that's boring. Like you want to be able to like be a player and have a preset or the ability to change talents or whatever based on the scenario, and there's actual decisions you make. And I think it's close. Like as Frosty K, 100%, you would not play every single Mythic Plus dungeon the same. You would not play every single AoE raid fight or single target raid fight the same. It would kind of depend on a few things. And I think that they have the idea. I just think there's no fucking way that they'll be able to correctly do that for 36, now 38 specs with Evoker. Is that right? Like some specs are going to have some cooked trees for sure. There's also going to be specs that get all their good shit and don't have to make any hard choices, and then you do that shit for the whole expansion. And then there's going to be classes that have to like majorly choose whether they need to do AoE or single target instead of having it handed to them. And I think balancing around that is going to be as hard as balancing Covenants or whatever the fuck else has been in the game recently. So I think it's going to be really hard to do.
Well, I certainly have no faith that all the talent trees are going to come out balanced. One thing I am probably more excited about than anything with talent trees is how they're going to fit together in a group. And talent trees as an individual player are interesting, but if that was the long and short of it, I would probably not be that excited. But when you look at things like being able to select an interrupt or not, I know there's a lot of healers that have been excited about like, oh, I can finally get an interrupt. And it's like, that's cool, but let's play that out to its conclusion, because here's what's going to happen is you're not going to gain interrupts in your group. There's going to be a DPS that says, I'm not taking interrupt because you're going to take interrupt healer and I'm going to take more DPS talents. And
no, dude, I got to stop you. I think the whole controversy on having interrupts being selectable is the most, I'm calling it right now, is going to be the most talked about problem that will never exist in real time next expansion. No one's going to fucking talk about this. I don't think it'll matter. Most of the specs, Druid is an example where you have to take a few extra points. I played around with the Druid tree. You're not missing a lot by selecting that kick. Classes that have a kick now that are not adding something like Soul Bash, like Resto and Moonkin, have you basically are automatically getting it. Like if you want to use DK as the class they've released so far that has a kick by default, that is like, it's 100% you take it. There's no choice. It's pick something you need, kick into Icebound Fortitude. There's zero chance you don't take kick. I think almost every class in the game that currently has a kick is going to have it basically for free. In classes where you have like Solar Beam and you can get an extra one, or Resto Druid where, you know, you're getting a Skull Bash that you haven't previously had, you have to make a few extra choices, but you have to fill out the amount of points in that like small top part of the tree before you can even move on anyway. And there's not typically a ton of choices. And even if there were, I really doubt that you'd see people doing that in actual content. And then even if they were, dude, I've been doing like pug keys for this last week. You could have told me that some fucking warrior in my key just didn't select pummel, which I don't think is going to be a thing, by the way. And I'd be like, yeah, I could believe it. He didn't kick one time. Fine. We still timed the easy ass 15 or whatever. You know, like I really, really don't think that it's going to be a big issue at all.
And admittedly, I am looking at this from like an MDI standpoint, where you will be like hyper optimizing your group. But that's the thing that gets me excited, is that you would approach talent trees as a group. Essentially, you would treat talent trees as, you know, 5 talent trees combined, or in a raid 20 talent trees combined, and you'd say, we need these things across 5 talent trees. You know, we need to have 3 interrupts. Like the most interrupts we'll ever need on a particular pull in this dungeon.
You don't think that sounds cool as fuck? That sounds awesome.
I was saying, I like that. Like I like having all of the talent trees. Like I said, if it was just me deciding my own talents in a vacuum, it'd be kind of cool. But you know,
yeah, JB, I got bad news for you, bro. You're picking that kick 100% of the time.
I know. That's what I'm saying. I'm taking the kick. But I'm the type of guy that like I don't mind like taking on the like more boring kit if it means that somebody else gets to do cool shit, because I just like when cool shit happens. It doesn't have to be me doing the cool shit. I just like enabling cool shit. Even if I have to play the more boring thing for that to happen, I like making group optimizations. And so I like this idea that you can pass off, you know, it's like, well, my talent tree by itself wouldn't allow me to take both a kick and this other thing, and I feel like in most situations I'd need both of those. But if you have a group where you can, you know, optimize that, then you can say like, all right, I'm not going to take the kick here, and it allows me to get this other thing that will improve damage by 2%. And normally there's no way I'd trade that off for a kick, but if I know that we'll have enough kicks in this group because the healer's going to take one, then I feel confident with taking that talent, and that's a lot of fun to me.
Yeah, here, I'm going to share my screen real quick for you too. Do you see this tree right? This is where I think it's actually cool too, because everyone assumes that healers are, oh my god, my camera's in the middle of my fucking screen on my stream. Hold up. I think that healers are just like going to automatically select kicks. Healers deal with it. I think every melee that currently has a kick is going to have something like this. If you're a frost DK, or any DK, literally any DK, Mind Freeze IBF, the entire expansion you will have this. And it's also people who've been kicking for multiple years. I think what you could have an issue with is like you go into a raid fight and you're like, all right, we need 5 kicks, like something like Prototype, right? Like you assign 4 kicks per ad, and you're like, all right, we're just gonna have the healers deal with this one. Yeah, real smart. Let's have the healers that besides Resto Shamans haven't been assigned to a kick for like ever. Let's have them do that for the first time in Mythic progression while they're also, you know, healing, and like that's gonna work. I think it's a bad idea. I don't think almost anything is gonna change with kicks at all. I think the only reason that interrupts are on this are on this talent tree is because they also put every other basic ability on this talent tree. I really think that this is not a like false sign. I think every class that currently kicks normally is getting it for free, and it's a bygone conclusion point that they will use. So I don't think it's going to be a huge deal, and I think there's also scenarios where maybe you don't end up taking it even at a higher level because you have better choices as a druid here to time the key than taking that specific kick, right? I think it'll definitely be based on the exact key or raid boss you're doing. Go ahead,
I do think certain like utilities for druid specifically are maybe a bit far down, like something like Innervate, because I think Innervate is such a specific utility that gives you absolutely nothing, like for the druid.
I am never taking Innervate. I am never taking
That's
Innervate.
the thing, probably. I mean, in M plus it's probably not needed either, right? Because healers usually don't really need innervated M plus, so it's fine. But for raiding, I think it's much more required, and it really like requires you to put a lot of points into that area, which I think is okay, but it definitely like reduces the amount of utility you can choose in like the druid tree as a Moonkin raider, you know, and maybe also as like a different raider. I don't know.
Well, another thing about the talent trees that I am excited for is that I think it'll make people really evaluate how important things are to them on their class, and it'll cause you to, when abilities are baseline, you don't have to think about whether that ability is good or not. You have it. It's just, there's no decision there. You just have it. I think it'll be interesting to force certain class communities to really stop and say, like, how important is that ability? I know that we make a big deal out of it. Like, very often you try to either over or undersell certain things that you have, depending on your goals. If you're trying to get invited to a group, you'll tell them that, like Soothe is the best ability in the game. Or if you're trying to get buffed, then you'll tell them that, like Treants is actually really not that good and they die really fast. And so there's like a constant sort of meta game in WoW of trying to deceive people on the usefulness of the spells that you have. But I think there's also been some level of self-deception in WoW. And now that players are going to have to be forced to select a lot of the things that they've just gotten for free, you'll have to take sort of stock of your inventory and say, like, which of these abilities that I have do I actually care about, and which of them do I only use because it's there? And I think that'll be a very interesting thing to see which of these abilities actually make the cut when you're allowed to pick among them.
Yeah, which is the cool shit. I think talent's own. But I really hope they continue to release like 2 trees at a time, because there will always be people that complain about stuff, whether they're legitimate complaints or they just like hate Blizzard and are going to post about it. But like, I think most people I've talked to that play both classes are very big fans. They're like, they see a lot of cool stuff you can do that you've never been able to do before, and like already like people like us that are, people who are going to spend a ton of time on this and not going to be people copying builds that like really care about this. It's like a dream. Like, I'm pretty sure every person I know that plays WoW is going to log on to alpha whenever they get it and just infinitely fuck around with playing around with these trees, right? Like, and there really hasn't even been a system they've added that's been like that in a long time. But I hope they do it 2 at a time. The worst thing they could ever do is try to work on the next batch and it's like 6 classes or something, because then it's just so much work for one thing. A lot of stuff's going to slip through the cracks and they're going to be trying to do too much. They really should just like hard focus on like a couple at a time, release them incrementally, and then have them available to people. But with how early alpha is coming out, I doubt it definitely seems like something where we're going to log on and there's just going to be every class's talent thing, and you're just going to be logging on and playing with it at the same time, at least all of the ones that aren't out now.
Yeah, so the one thing that I actually worried about when I looked at the Moonkin tree, and this is specifically for Moonkin, because Starfall, the way it works in Shadowlands, I think the majority of the player base doesn't like that it's not stackable, and that sometimes it even has a cooldown. And people just kind of hate that this is a thing for Moonkin. And when we saw the talent tree, we saw that Starfall is still working the same way as it does now. And I don't think that means that it necessarily is going to stay like that for Dragonflight. Like, maybe they're going to rethink it. But it's, I think, a little bit worrying that they're working on the talent system first before they address certain issues for specs and classes that are an issue throughout all of Shadowlands, right? Because if they do the talents first, and then afterwards they're like, oh, maybe we should make Starfall stack. Well, then all of a sudden the position of the talents in the tree maybe are wrong or don't work out anymore, and that can be an issue, right?
Very
yeah,
true.
I do sort of. I am sort of disappointed that we got the talent trees without also getting the sort of spells that go along with them, because I feel like that we get an incomplete picture there. A lot of I walked through the Druid talent tree when it first got released, and I was like, well, this is a really good talent if this Druid spell stays the same way it is, or if this Druid spell changes in Dragonflight, this will be a really cool build. But if it stays the way it is right now, I don't think that's that good. So I kind of wish they released the 2 of them together. And I mean, it's not the first time we've seen Blizzard do something like that, where they release things in parts, and you really can't know how it's all going to fit together until you get the whole thing. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't get that for quite a while. So, playing around with the talent tree is fun, but it also feels so, even for the talent trees that have been released, it just feels so premature that it's like, yeah, I mean, it's cool. I like the idea, but I don't think I can make any sort of statement on what this means for Druid until we see the whole thing.
Dude, I need to point out something. What have warlocks and mages done to the community to where Moonkins are like insanely good in Castle Nathria and Sanctum and Mythic Plus at the beginning of this expansion, and they just so effortlessly live rent-free in every WoW player's minds as like this class that is like this evil class, when like mages and warlocks have actually been that good or better for like 15 years. And
It is mind blowing to me. I think I'm blaming titles.
No, it's because Moonkins look so fucking dumb. Like, how can you look at a Moonkin and not hate that thing? Like, independent of how good or bad it is, it looks so stupid that it's easy to be like, only evil people would play that dumb-looking bird. Like, that's so much of why they get, like, shit on so much, is that, like, mages and warlocks have had pretty cool-looking armor. Like, their tier sets are, I think, some of the more memorable tier sets throughout WoW, and cloth armor tends to just look good all the time. So it's easy to look at mage and warlock characters and be like, oh, that thing's badass. You look at a Moonkin and you're like, that thing is an idiot. Like, that thing will, like, it looks like something that would die to every raid mechanic. Like, it looks like stupid people would play that thing all the time. So
Dude,
it's easy
Jesus.
to say, like, oh, look how stupid that looks. Stupid people must play it. Like, that it's like, it's easy to make that
Now I
leap.
know why everyone hates Moonkins. It's
Yes.
JB.
Yeah, well, no, it's not. No, it's not me. I'm
No,
just saying what
it's
everyone's
you.
thinking. I'm saying what
no,
everyone's
fair.
thinking.
all right, hell yeah. Okay, we're kind of wrapping this up, but I did want to point out something that Naguura brought up on Twitter the other day. You said that Blizzard needs to, there's a lot of like different ways you can do damage in this game. There's like 2-target cleave and funnel, and like classes do some things differently than others, but you mentioned that like spammable mass AoE should be normalized and like balanced among every class in the game. And I actually, for some reason, haven't like heard that take before, but that 100% needs to happen. Like, it's actually the weirdest thing. I think probably needed to happen since Mythic Plus more than anything else, because it gets handled in a raid. But that is something that they should pay they should pay as close attention to that in PvE as they do single target, because it's just a massive reason why there's a game mode that so many people play in PvE that doesn't it like affects every decision people make, basically.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think Blizzard kind of tried to band-aid fix this issue that like mass AoE is like almost exclusively the only thing that you needed in Plus, by trying to put things into in Plus, like affixes and whatever, that promote like single target damage or other forms of damage. And it just never worked out. Like, all the things they put in, there was like singular mobs, people either skipped them or pulled stuff on top and AoE'd anyway, right? Because in the end, over the 3 seasons or 3 expansions that we had in Plus now, it was always the classes that did the most like stacked AoE damage and burst AoE damage that were brought to the group. And I still think that it's not like perfectly balanceable, even if they attempt to balance stacked AoE, just because there's only 3 damage dealers that fit into a dungeon, and it's just really impossible. But they can at least attempt doing it, so classes that are the worst at them Plus right now are at least not like doing 50% less damage than the best, right? Because I think that is a little bit of an issue. And I also don't think it affects any other part of the game really negatively, because in PvP, you don't do stacked AoE, and in raids, there is stacked AoE, but it's like a very niche thing that happens, and I don't think it would hurt the raid very much if all classes would be somewhat good at it.
Oh, also, definitely agree. And then one more thing for JB, because you're a Mythic Plus guy. So I've been doing a lot of Mythic Plus lately. I actually have crazy score. It's insane. And I've done a few gambits, and I'm convinced that the best dungeon in the entire expansion would just be the beginning of Gambit over and over again. How do you feel about, especially as a healer, them adding like a ton of mechanics to the game to make you not want to like pull super big, but in reality the most fun Mythic Plus ever is when you just like pull fucking everything and
Oh,
own it.
100%. Like that's what that's so frustrating to me that they like I don't want necessarily Mythic Plus to be super high effort on the trash pulls. Like trash pulls are when you have fun. Trash pulls are when you explode shit. And like, yeah, maybe you need to make some unavoidable damage that comes out with it. Something to do. Like, you know, there's some stops you need to get in Gambit. Like, make sure if fish stick goes off, your pull's fucked. So there's some things you have to do besides just blow stuff up. But like, that is 100% the most fun stuff in WoW is just annihilating large packs of trash sort of mindlessly. And every dungeon needs to have at least some of that. If people ask what my favorite dungeon is, the answer is very easy. It's Freehold, and it's because Freehold is basically that the whole way.
Yeah, fucking love it.
Yep.
You
I
just
wonder-
pull a bunch of shit and you slam 15 mobs at a time, and you take occasional breaks for bosses, and then you go back to slamming 15 mobs at a time.
Yeah, no, I definitely, I think that would be a great design change, and they're definitely being like, oh, this is actually, we can do one more topic, where I wonder what they're gonna do next expansion with this, but I really would love to see the dungeons in general shortened. The trash in between bosses is just mass pulling, and then the dungeon, and then the difficulty being in like having more unique, cool hard bosses. I think like they don't even have to be like, I'm not talking like niche shit. I just mean like, like Gambit again, like the last boss in Gambit, like that shit owns. Like bosses like that.
I think the problem with bosses specifically is the fact that you have the same bosses that barely get changed by affixes actually throughout the whole expansion, and
Except for next
bosses
expansion,
don't really
though.
change. Exactly right. That's why I think this is going to be good, because like last expansion and the expansion before, you just played the same boss for 2 years. And with trash, it's always a bit different because the affixes affect the trash, and you do different pulls depending on the affix week as well. So the trash pulls are always a bit different, but boss pulls are always the same. The only thing that changes is that Tyrannical makes it do a bit more damage and lasts a bit longer, which is not necessarily changing the boss fight, right? It's just more annoying. And I do think that having the bosses change throughout seasons, because the dungeons change, is going to be much better. And I also think that they maybe should think about affixes that actually affect boss fights, and maybe boss fights only. So instead of having something like Tyrannical, you have affixes that affect boss fights differently and not buffing their HP and making them do more damage, but things that buff them like mechanically. So it's like more interesting to do them and not just takes longer and does more damage or whatever.
I am sort of with you, but the first thing that comes to mind is the Oros debuff on bosses, and I never want to experience that again. Like,
Wait, what's
this idea
Oros
of
again?
Okay, the snare, the dude last
Oh,
season.
yeah.
Snare on you?
No,
Okay.
that's not that.
It's like I'd like to see bosses be kind of different, like mix it up. It's like, okay, that sounds cool. But then the first thing I think of is season 2, where I got 50% snared and I wanted to die in every dungeon.
The answer to what that would look like 100% is what faded affixes will look like in Raid's next patch, is what boss affixes would look like in Mythic Plus.
Yeah.
But
and we'll see how that works, right?
here's my biggest fear for Mythic Plus in the next patch. I've noticed in this patch, I've actually had a ton of fun, and I think the main reason for that is because the seasonal affix is actually fucking insanely good. Where I think like the seasonal affix is actually so hit or miss to where like in some seasons, like you can think of the worst ones in your head where it like makes it just entirely less fun to play the entire season, and some where it actually adds to the content straight up. Like I would argue that this one just makes Mythic Plus more fun than if it wasn't there, and good. So, and also the dungeons, there's a lot of the dungeons that are actually quite good to do over and over again. Some are not, right? Like Spires, at least that I've experienced, where it like just seems just kind of bland and boring. How much does it matter that you're doing new content versus you're doing content that is good and repeatable? Example, let's say next season 1 of Dragonflight, they do the 4 first Dragonflight dungeons and 4 that they're bringing back from a previous expansion. And it's cool and it's new and you have a great set. Like 6 of the dungeons are good. I think if 6 out of the 8 dungeons are like really good, that's like a really high clip. Like that's a really good dungeon set. And then in season 2, in the effort of making things new and innovative, which will be fun for the first, 2 to 4 weeks of a season, probably for the people who do this all the time. What happens if you get a set where only 3 of them are really good and 5 are bad? Is that actually better having new dungeons every season if it means that there's like a variable quality element where you'd actually rather potentially doing the insane dungeons the entire time, or allowing them to like keep it open, like if they stumble across, whatever X dungeon in your mind is like insanely good and should always be in the dungeon rotation. Like like you use Freehold as an example, right? Like if they stumble across a Freehold in the first season of next patch, are they smart enough to keep that specific dungeon, right? Or something like that. What are your all's thoughts on that?
Well, so I'm probably, well, I don't know that I'd say the minority, but my guess is maybe in the minority, where I have no problem with playing the same dungeons all expansion long, because I'm not necessarily doing the dungeon for the sake of the dungeon. I'm using it as a measuring stick. And in the same way, like I've talked about this before and used the comparison of like maps in MOBAs, where you don't have a different map every time you're in a MOBA game. Like it's the same map every time, but it's the heroes that change, or champions, whatever fucking game you're playing. And to me, that's where I like, if I want to mix stuff up in Mythic Plus, I would rather that we get class rebalance and we go in and we're all playing different classes. And that would be the new part of the dungeon to me, is like, okay, it's all the same shit that I've seen before, but now I'm doing it with a priest instead of a druid, or a shaman instead of a paladin. And that changes enough of the way that you approach it. I mean, it is honestly kind of weird when you go into a dungeon and you feel like you've done it a ton of times, but you're playing a new character, and you go into a pull that you've done hundreds of times, and you're like, I don't know how to heal this pull. I've never done this on this character before. I don't know how I'm going to heal this pull. Like, it feels so easy to do on my other characters, but I'm going to have to relearn it on this character. And so, like, I find that a lot of times just changing the meta up changes the dungeons in a way that kind of provides that new feeling for me. But also a lot of it is just like, I like having the same dungeons the whole expansion, because that's how I kind of track progress with our routes and strats. If I was getting new dungeons all the time, it would be hard for me to have a sort of consistent idea in my mind of like what a good
That's so
time
interesting.
in the dungeon is.
Dude, if I was a Mythic Pluser, dude, I feel like my main thing would be that I'm just doing this, like a seasonal affixes changes it, and the meta changes it, because that's actually something that Blizzard maybe even unintentionally has done, is they've made the meta totally different in every season, probably on accident, but like, and it's been different. But I would really think that like a Mythic Pluser would actually just be like longing for, just like what raids get, where every season you just get a full new slate of shit to figure out, assuming the quality was the same. But
well, it's like speed running. I mean, like when you have guys that speed run games, it's the same fucking game every time. It's the same route. I mean, theoretically, and you're just trying to do it a little bit faster, a little bit faster, a little bit faster, a little bit faster. And if you said to us, like a Mario 64 speedrunner, like, wouldn't you like it if we mixed in like Super Mario Brothers 3 occasionally? They'd be like, no, that defeats the entire fucking purpose of my speedrun. Like,
yeah, speedrunning is like giga niche though. Like, mad respect to all speedrunners, but I mean, like,
I know, that's what I'm saying, is like, that's how and that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm sure that this is like a minority opinion, but that's part of what the appeal of Mythic Plus to me is that we're doing the same thing every time, so that I can sort of measure my progress in, like, against the same dungeon every time, knowing that like this pull was this hard earlier in the season and we've gotten better at it, or here's how hard it was in gear earlier in the season, and look how cool my gear is now that I can do all these things with my gear that make this pull easier, or changing up the pulls and feeling like, man, this used to suck early in the season, but look how much better we've made it by delaying bringing this pack in. And so I don't, as an individual, I don't need new stuff all the time in Mythic Plus to keep me satisfied. You could keep giving me the same dungeon. Like, there are parts of Mythic Plus that I would like to see change up. Like, I wouldn't want the same meta the entire expansion, but if I'm getting like different classes, different items, as seasonal affixes changing up a bit, like, I feel like that provides enough new stuff that I don't mind it being against the same sort of backdrop the entire time.
Yeah, there's a lot of people agreeing with you in chat. That's just like not what I would think that like Mythic. Well, I mean your logic is totally sound. But yeah, that is definitely interesting.
Yeah, I was about to say the complete opposite, probably. Where I personally think that changing up the dungeons every season, like I'm not saying that this is exactly what Mythic Plus needs overall, but I'm saying trying it out would probably be really good for the game because I think there's quite a few people that like doing M Plus at like maybe at the start, when expansion comes out, they do some dungeons and they like it, but then they kind of don't want to do it anymore for like a few months. And then afterwards they come back, and all of a sudden everyone in the high-end plus scene knows every small detail about everything, and you don't, and you feel like an idiot. And then you just lose all motivation to even keep
DK
going
Seed.
because you would have to learn so much because
DK
the
Seed.
amount of knowledge you can have about M Plus is infinite, especially when you're playing the same dungeons for 2 years. But if the dungeon pool changes every season, I think the amount of things you can learn is very limited, or much more limited than if you would play it for 2 years. And additionally, like every season would feel much fresher and much newer. And the thing that you said earlier, Max, where you were saying that what if 6 dungeons are bad and only 2 are good? I think this technically can also be the opposite, right? Like, what if an expansion comes out and you don't like 6 of the dungeons, but then the next season comes out and all of a sudden you like 5 of them, Like, I think it can literally also be the opposite. Of course, it's bad if it comes out and you like a lot of the dungeons and then they're gone. But I do think that is something that Blizzard can really look at and really monitor, like how much people like certain dungeons, and then maybe pick those dungeons that are similar
Yeah.
to them.
I was trying to
right?
run that in my head of like what this expansion would have looked like with that. And then also, but the only issue with that is it comes down to community votes. And I think the only issue with that is like they need to not actually have the community vote. They need to get like a group of people together that know what they're talking about and have them vote.
Yeah.
Because the community 100% voted for Grimrail Depot, right? So that
Yes.
like, yeah, and it's like Grimrail Depot, very cool, like challenge mode dungeon, would not translate to Mythic Plus at all. It's going to be bad. And yeah, I just don't know if that's the case. But like say you do that this expansion, right? Like, okay, right now, end of season 1. I don't even remember what the fuck the affix was. I didn't do it. Like end of season 1, you guys are in charge of what dungeons would you vote to be rotated out for the second season to have old things brought back if you were to play it like that? Are there any?
Definitely Plaguefall. I hate that dungeon. Necrotic Wake.
You hate Plaguefall? See, this is the thing.
Oh, yes.
I feel like my dungeons, like what I've preferred or disliked throughout the expansion, has changed. Where at different points in the expansion, I would have said like I hate this dungeon, or this dungeon's like not that bad anymore. Some of that probably has to do with the meta, and that's what we were talking about earlier. Is like a lot of times the dungeon changes when you change classes. Like things that you had an answer for with certain metas, you don't have an answer for anymore, or things that you lacked an answer for, suddenly you have an answer for. And as the meta evolves over time, like taking the slime, the haste slime in Plaguefall, like figuring out you could bring 2 Necrolords and take double haste, like that made so many things in that dungeon that were previously incredibly painful kind of trivial. And so Plaguefall's a dungeon now where like I like it in a way that I probably didn't earlier in the expansion, because I think we've figured out more ways to kind of speed it up and make it easier. But I would say the dungeons that will never get better are the ones where they force you to do certain pulls that you can't really innovate on. Like one dungeon I'm not a huge fan of is like Theater of Pain, because I feel like you can't really change what you pull in the dungeon. You can change the order that you pull the stuff in the dungeon, but there's almost universal consensus on which are the correct mobs to pull and which ones are not. And it's just a matter of like, do you go to Zav's wing first, or do you go to Gorchop's wing first? And in the same way that like King's Rest was that kind of linear dungeon, there's no decision making really in the key. It's just on rails, and that removes so much of the like interesting part of the dungeon for me, of like thinking through what you want to pull and weighing whether that's an efficient use of time on that pack or not. And so I tend to not, and I think that tends to make indoor dungeons a thing that I like less, because I think that the indoor dungeon experience just translates to that more often. It's more confined. It's harder to you don't ever really have like spacious indoor dungeons. So almost by definition, an indoor dungeon means it's cramped. It means it's harder to skip things. It's more likely, I think, to be a linear dungeon, and I don't like that. I tend to like the outdoor dungeons where there's mob packs all over the place. You can run between them much more easily. Very often the bosses are put in a way that you can pull them in different orders. And I think that if I were to pick the dungeons I like most, it usually tends to be the ones that are more spread out and you have more freedom to move about the dungeon, which, if it sounds like I'm describing Freehold, you are 100% correct. I am describing Freehold. So I would say that the closer that a dungeon is to Freehold, the better it is, and the further away from Freehold it is, the worse it is, as a general rule.
Okay. Quick question then. Well, Naguura, first of all, do you agree with him on that specifically? The thing that I'm talking about too is you mentioned innovation in there, and then also I've heard someone say recently that like how impressive it was about how much, even with these dungeons being out for a year and a half, that people are still finding ways to innovate these keys in this current expansion to where you're doing some things differently. If you were doing a completely new set of 8 dungeons every season, do you think that the level of innovation, if people were used to that, would increase to where you would get to that final point much faster?
I 100% agree, because I think right now there's very few people who innovate, because there's some groups that go on beta already for the expansion and they do some dungeons and they figure out some stuff, and yeah, there's like a bunch of things you'll figure out later on as well, but like a big portion of struts that are being figured out are by like, I would say like less than 50 people, maybe even less, that just really want to do routes and really figure out these kind of details by doing really high keys and playing the game a lot. So I do think by changing the dungeons up more often, more people are going to be able to figure out these kind of things, and maybe are also interested in doing it. Maybe they haven't been interested before that, especially because most of the figuring out happens during beta as well, which a lot of people don't necessarily like playing. And I do think, going back to your question about how would Blizzard figure out which dungeons are liked more, I think a very simple way, well, simple-ish way for them to figure out which dungeons are liked the most is by changing the key system for your key to just be a key level. So let's say my key level is 22. I time the key that I'm doing, it turns to 23 or depletes to 21, but I can use it on any dungeon, because I think that was an issue in the past before we had score. But now we have score, and people have to do the dungeons anyway if they want the score. So it's not going to be that people only play mists or only play halls. People actually are going to play all the dungeons anyway to get score, right? So I think that kind of issue is kind of solved nowadays. And it would really show, okay, if people only do Plaguefall twice to get score, and then they use all of their other keys to do halls, then it's kind of obvious that Plaguefall is just not a dungeon people like, right?
Sure. The only issue with that is if they were tracking which one of those keys people were doing, they also might not necessarily find you doing the best dungeon, but the dungeon that is easy and most likely to +2, right? Like if they were,
that's why I would even go further on Naguura's suggestion and say you don't even have to time the key to select the level. You can just pick whatever level you want to do. You just go.
I very heavily disagree with that.
If you want to go right to 30, go right to 30.
Oh, no.
In my mind, it's like you don't have to do heroic raid to step into Mythic. Like you could just go right into Mythic. And now I know you could say like, well, you got to kill the early Mythic bosses to get to the later ones. But in my mind, it's like let your skill level determine what you're capable of doing. Like if you want to go time at 30 and you can time at 30, why add in a bunch of steps of like, I have to time at 21, 22, 23. Let me just go right to the 30 and time it. And if I suck, then I'm not going to time it.
So I 100% understand your take, and this is something that people have been talking about a lot.
Dude, JB
and
is so
I honestly think that
chat.
They should just have 2 different kind of key levels, or 2 different keys maybe even, so you can do that. But the thing is, for me, because I like playing in Plus the way it is right now, and if they would change the keys to never like deplete, and I can choose whatever key level I want, I would hate in Plus. Because then it would turn into this, I would hate it because it would turn into this min-maxy thing where you played like in a tournament realm or like in Plus, where you go in, you try some crazy pull, it doesn't work, you go out. You go in, you try to pull, you go out, right? And I would hate that kind of playing, because that's what I already do in raiding, right? In raids, I try a boss 500 times until the boss dies. And I already have that there. In M+, I want to improvise and to do the best I can this one time I do the dungeon. And I don't want to like immediately run out as soon as something goes wrong. And I don't want to sit there, look at MDT for an hour and theorize and optimize. And every single global and every single CD I'm using in a dungeon doesn't need to be optimized. I want it to be more of like a thing that requires like in the moment gameplay, you know what I mean? And not all of this like fully like fleshed out, detailed min-maxy thing. It would definitely turn into that if you could just do the keys as many times as you want.
Yes, the crazy pulls are the fun ones. That's the I want to do the pull that's just insane from start to finish, and you feel like you're gonna die the whole time, and you do most of the time. But that one magical time when it all goes correctly, and that's the oh my
Like
god,
killing
it's
a
so
mythic
good.
boss.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly.
That is exactly like that feeling that you get when you've done a mythic boss that's like a 10-minute fight, and when you started pulling it, you were like, how the hell are we ever going to kill this? But just like one step at a time, you figure out the fight in chunks, and you start like, oh wow, we made it through phase 1. This is kind of doable. And then phase 2, phase 3, and finally put it all together, and it's like, wow, holy crap. Like 5 days ago I could not imagine getting past 70% on this boss, and we're killing it now. And it's the same way when you put together a very aggressive dungeon route where you start going into these pulls, and you're like, oh man, I don't even have Infernal up for another minute. Like, how are we going to kill this? And it's like, figure it out. Like, I don't know how you're going to do it, but we got to pull it, so figure it out.
The thing is, like, I 100% understand your take, but I just completely disagree, and I wouldn't like it. So what I'm saying is, like, I'm not trying to take away your thing either. Like, technically, I think there's a world where we could have both things. Like, one is like my version, the current version that I really like doing, and one is like a different version where you maybe have a keystone that you can play and do whatever you want with. And maybe it doesn't even like drop items, maybe it drops cosmetics or whatever, like I think both of it can exist.
Yeah, we could put it on that tournament realm I was talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, dude. Some guy in my chat had such, I don't know why it made me laugh so hard, but someone in my chat just goes, I hope Blizzard gives this guy his tournament realm so they can quarantine this psycho.
Yeah, no, I get it. Like, it is like, I know it's like, it's weird. Like I say shit, and it's like offensive to people because it's so different from what World of Warcraft is. And I recognize 100% that it's not normal. I don't have normal opinions.
Oh, quick question. Yeah, all good. Also, we're about to finish this up. So JB, you mentioned that like how like the pull is like the same as the mythic boss. What makes you dislike mythic rating? Is it the antiquity and how long like tried and true systems are still there in WoW guilds that are like super annoying because this game is old, or is it because of the group size?
I honestly think it just boils down to group size. I've tried to figure that out. Like, what is it about mythic rating that is so different from dungeons that I really prefer 5-man content and really don't care for 20-man content that much? And honestly, I think a lot of it boils down to the healer role. I think I just like being the only healer in the dungeon. Like, that responsibility falls solely on my shoulders, and that I know that if any healing is going to be done outside of some sort of incidental self-healing from some DPS classes or whatever, that like that's on me, and I am coordinating the entire healing assignment by myself. I don't like having to delegate healing across like 3 or 4 different people, and we have our cooldowns mapped out, and this is my turn to trank and your turn to use healing tide, and like that part I don't like. I like knowing that all of the healing assignment is mine, and I don't have to. I think there's like stepping on toes when you're in a raid where you go to heal somebody and their health tops itself off because somebody else squeezed in a global first, and you're just like, wow, that was annoying. And you don't have to really deal with that in Mythic Plus. And I mean,
it's definitely. I mean, it's pretty much the same. I think it's like a healer and tank thing, because I think tanking is also something that's like a very, very different role in Mythic Plus, because you're like doing it on your own instead of with another person. Although that doesn't make sense for why it. I mean, the amount of like good tanks doing Mythic Plus at a high level is like probably like the smallest. It's like the smallest faction of people in the game, right? Like that's like there's like almost none of them. All right, I think we're good. I think we had a nice conversation.
Yeah, this was good.
Yep.
Yeah, it was cool. Thanks for coming on, guys.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yep. All right. See you guys.
See you guys.
Yep.
Have a good one. See ya.